The doors of the throne room had never hung quite straight. Even now, when the gold leaf flaked from the high pillars and soot darkened the ribs of the vaults, when the long carpet down the middle was threadbare as an old wound, the doors made the same small protest, a weary groan that carried and carried. Arya stood listening to it before she pushed them wider with both hands and let the hall breathe out its charred breath. It smelled of ashes and of iron. Someone had scrubbed blood from the steps below the dais. A pinkish stain had soaked deep into the porous stone and dried there in a spell of heat, and there it would remain until the next fire and the one after that. She stood still just inside the doors, feeling for the weight of needle along her spine. The sword lay in its sheath beneath the plain black riding cloak she wore. She touched the hilt through leather and cloth. Her breath went in, out. The sound drifted to the rafters and came back smaller. Behind her, the guards shifted, uncertain, the way dogs do on a threshold when told to wait. The gold cloak's armor no longer shone. None of them wore gold any longer. The paint had been scraped. The gilding melted down along with rings and brooches and eating spoons. The captain had a thick brow and a scar that made his left ear lie flat. He had told her that he had 2 children in Flea Bottom and that he would keep order if she would keep them fed. She had told him she would. "Wait here," she said without turning. The captain grunted assent. Boots tamped, then settled. She went alone down that long aisle, past the cracked braziers with their last dull embers, past the tall windows whose leaded panes still trapped a few scraps of blue morning. Dust swam through those patches of light. Every mote drifted and spun like a homecoming snowflake. Arya's boots left little crescents in the ash that had settled on the flagstones. There were dried rose petals scattered like old lies along the way. She'd never liked roses. The petals made a whispering sound against the sole of her boot. It sounded like the rustle of silk along a wall, a sound she remembered from 100 rooms where she had not been herself. The Iron Throne looked smaller than it had when she was a child and had seen it from the gallery with her sister and had whispered jokes into her sleeve until Septa Mordain pinched her arm. Smaller but sharper. Up close the seat was an accident waiting to happen. Blades and tangs and edges fused and twisted, with points that seemed to quiver with impatience whenever a breeze found its way through the hall. The throne had cut as many as it had crowned, they used to say. She didn't know how many that was. She knew the feel of steel entering a body in silence, and the weight after the way a body went slack. This chair was a monument to that sensation, raised up for everyone to watch. She put her hand on the back of it. The metal was cold, and there were slight grooves where a dozen generations' hands had tried to tame it. She traced one groove with a fingertip and let her skin learn its path. She had learned the ways of stone in bravos, the ways of wood and rope and locks. She ran her finger over a line of old blood black in a crevice where no cloth had reached, and felt time there, sticky, refusing to be washed clean. "You could sit," the silence seemed to say. "You could sit and be done with wandering." She did not sit. She went behind the throne instead and found the narrow space between iron and wall where servants once crept to tend the brazier that warmed a king's calves in winter. No brazier there now, only a mouse nest of lint, dark and soft, a few gnawed cracker crumbs. She cupped the nest in her palm and brought it out and dropped it on the cold ashes of the nearest brazier. The nest made the softest sound as it fell apart, a sigh no louder than a breath let out in the dark by someone who knows she cannot sleep. "Your Grace," the captain said from far away, a little too loud. The title went skittering along the stones like a startled rat. He coughed as if to take it back. She heard his boots approach a step or two. He stopped, and the silence crept back from the corners. "Not yet," Arya said. Then, after the length of a winter heartbeat, "Bring the first petitioner." The echo took the words and set them aside, careful as a midwife with a swaddled child. Hours later, she would remember that the first one had been a girl with pinched cheeks and a bundle wrapped in an old velvet curtain. But now, before the doors opened again and before the day's business found its thin legs, Arya stood with the throne at her back and felt the hall's weight lean on her in a way that warmed and chilled by turns. It had cost so much to quiet the hall. Too much, perhaps. If you named a price and paid it, what did it make you? She had often wondered that on the road, with the taste of river mud at the back of her throat and Jaqen Hagar's lesson stones clicking in her pocket. She turned and faced the throne and let herself see it as it would look if she sat. The sword points would frame her face like a thorn crown. Her feet would be able to find the right places on the steps to look as if they had always belonged here. Her hands, small hands people called them, would rest on the arm spikes with careful indifference. The blades above and behind would be like a bramble, and if she leaned back she would be pricked for it. That thought pleased her. No one should be allowed to lean back and be comfortable on a chair that presided over so much discomfort. She did not want comfort. She wanted watching. The doors groaned again. The first petitioner came in, keeping to the left side where the carpet hardly thinned at all. A girl of perhaps 14 years, though her eyes had a way of being older, carrying a bundle that might have been a baby if it had moved. It did not move. The guard with the flat ear came to his knee a little clumsily and then rose again and stood like a post to one side. The girl approached with her head down until Arya said softly, "Look at me." She lifted her eyes. They were not fearful, or not only that. There was defiance there too, the kind that rises like steam when the pot is left unattended. Arya had seen it in her own reflection once, in a puddle in a Bravosi alley, when she was learning how to move like no one, and had failed and kicked over a bucket and made the cat scatter. "What's your name?" Arya asked. Names mattered. She had a list of them once, and she had said them each night like a prayer. Names still mattered. They made patterns in her mind that let the world be known. "Lena," the girl said. "My mother says Lena. My father called me Little Cat. But he's dead." Arya's mouth twitched. "There were times my father called me Little Wolf," she said. "There are worse names." Lena's bundle rested against her breast. The cloth was a faded blue velvet, the kind used at noble tables to dress the food and keep the flies out. Arya remembered the way such cloth felt on her fingers when she was young and stole grapes and stuck them in her mouth and laughed because the septa would scold. The old velvet was stiff in places and crusted with, she didn't need to look hard to know with what. "Leave it wrapped," Arya said. "Tell me what you ask." "I ask." The girl hesitated. The hall carried her breath to the rafters and back. "I ask that my brother's body be burned on a clean pyre and that I be allowed to keep the ashes." The city men said only nobles were allowed ash. They say to throw him on the trash fires. He wasn't trash. He worked. He was quick. He ran errands for the kitchens, and he never stole more than crusts. "Who told you that?" Arya asked. "The man with the scales," Lena said. "The one with the bald head and the good boots who sits by the west gate. He measures what we bring in to burn. He says no to us, yes to other folks. He smiles when he says no." Arya glanced toward the captain. "Bring the man with the scales," she said. "Bring him before the noon hour." The captain nodded, one quick jerk. "As you say." Arya reached down and put her broad, workmanlike hand on the bundle and felt the shape beneath the velvet. Small bones. Heat long fled. She had learned to tell where the warmth had gone from a body. It was a sort of map, and you followed it to find the place where the person had last been. She let the girl see her own eyes on the torn cloth, and then she withdrew her hand. "You will have a clean pyre," she said, "and a pot for the ashes. You'll have a place in the gardens by the gate to sit with him whenever you like. And the man at the scales will find a different place to sit, if he sits anywhere at all by sundown." Lena nodded. Her mouth worked as if to say thank you, but no sound came out. She settled for a quick bob, smoother than any curtsy she'd learned, and turned to go. "Wait," Arya said. "What was your brother's name?" "Vic," Lena said. "Short for vicar. He thought it was a grand name, but I told him it sounded like a pot banging." "It sounds like a bell," Arya said, and let the girl go. Names mattered. The next petitioner came with a sheaf of papers bound in twine and a mouth like a clamp and a voice that wanted to be a song but had a measure too many to be tuneful. He had penned a petition for relief on behalf of the fishers at Mudgate. He brought it himself, he said, because too many messages had gone astray lately on the way to the Red Keep. He said the nets caught more debris than fish now, and the debris was sharper. Arya told him to wait for the council table. The council table, which had once borne a map of the kingdoms carved into its top, was in a side chamber. The map itself was long since sanded down and replaced with scratches and spills. It would do. She would listen, and if men with nets brought sharp debris instead of fish, then she wanted to see the debris and cut her fingers on it. In that slow morning she saw a dozen people, and for each one she tasted the air around their plea for the sour tang of lies. Sometimes she found it, a thin slick like lamp oil at the top of a soup pot. Sometimes the air was clean. There was a man who swore that he had been robbed by a baker when the baker shorted him a loaf. When questioned, he could not say how many teeth the baker had, and it turned out he had never looked at the baker's face. There was a woman who asked for water rights to a broken aqueduct so she could sell buckets of clean water at the fish market. Her hands were raw, not the hands of a reseller. There was a cobbler who complained that a knight had drawn his sword over the price of a boot heel and nicked his ear. Arya sent a man for the knight and made the knight pay the cobbler's weight in coin. The knight had good boots, very fine boots. Arya watched him count the coin out of an embroidered purse and resolved to have plainer boots next time. When the sun had risen to cast narrow blades of light across the iron on the dais, she dismissed the last petitioner and stood for a while in the silence that followed. A quiet like that was a living thing. It came close and listened for what you would say next. She let it sit and wait. The guard with the flat ear shifted and did not cough. "Bring the council," Arya said at last. They came as they always did, in ones and twos, and then with a flurry of skirts and papers. The maester smelled of vellum and dust and ink, and had a few ink drops on his fingers that he had not bothered to wash. He said the stains reminded him what his hands were for. He was Kahlo, a thin, foxish man with a long nose and a chain that had more lead than silver to it, and proud of the lead. He knew how to mend a sewer and how to brew a fever tea. Arya liked him. He had no poetry in him, and she trusted that. The master of coin was a woman most people called the ragpicker queen. She told Arya that she had never picked rags a day in her life, but she had picked things from rags. Pins, buttons, hair combs, a dropped ring now and again, and it had taught her what poor people lost and what they hid. Her real name was Quill because, she said, she was always writing lessons down in her mind. She had teeth like fence posts and a laugh like a door slamming in a gale. She wore a gray dress with so many seal-sliced pockets Arya thought it might have been made from a map. She could tell the count of coins by the weight of the sack. There was the captain with the flat ear, Merrill, who had learned to watch the shadows for knives and to respect the hands that wielded pots and brooms. He stood because chairs never fit him and because he said that on his feet he could keep his temper. And then there was the last one, who came in late and without noise, and whose presence changed the taste of the air like the moment before snow. He had no seat on the council, since Arya had not yet decided whether to make one for a foreigner whose allegiances bled like a bandage. But he came and stood all the same, and no one told him to leave because everyone knew what his hands knew. He was a thin man with a sharp smell of the sea in his hair. He had eyes that did not hold an expression for longer than needed. "Your Braavosi friend," Quill said without malice. "I've counted his fingers a few times and always find them where I expect. That's a kind of honesty." "He's no friend," Arya said, but she did not send the Braavosi away. Friends were a luxury, and she had learned that luxuries made you slow. The man's name was Omero, or so he called himself here. The name had changed twice since he had arrived, and maybe it had changed twice before across the narrow sea. He was useful, and he did not hide it. Useful men often had to be watched because they intended to remain useful and needed everything around them to prove it. "State of the city," Arya said, and sat not on the iron but in the plain chair just below the throne. It was a craftsman's chair, good old oak, rubbed smooth by generations of backsides that had done the real work while kings warmed the spikes above. She planted both boots firmly on the step below and put her elbows on her knees and looked up, unblinking. She could sit a whole night that way, a whole winter. Sitting was a kind of blade if you knew how to hold still. The maester cleared his throat. "The water," he began, and then more directly, "Some cisterns are uncontaminated. The old aqueducts will carry if we clear them, but when rubble goes down, rats come up. They are not the worst plague, but they are a plague. I propose." "Burn lime," Quill said. "Spread it thicker than a brag. Boys can do it if they wear cloth over their mouths." I have cloth. It is the wrong kind of cloth for summer dresses, so the cloth sellers will be glad to be rid of it and feel they've tricked me, when in truth I will have tricked them. She set down a small pouch on the table. It clinked like a handful of teeth. Coin for salaries, which must be honest if not generous. Do it, Arya said. What about food? Ships at the mouth of the Blackwater, Omero said with his soft voice. 2 from Myr, 1 from Gulltown. 3 that left Bravos and tried to turn back in this season only to find my friends standing in their path with oars. His smile was quick, like a knife sheathed mid-strike. Prices will not be pleasant, until they are. They'll be as pleasant as I say, Quill said. She had a way of scratching her jaw with the edge of a coin as she thought. We'll call in the hoarded wheat from the Stormlands that folk prefer to pretend they don't hold. We'll fetch the barley and the oats that presently make rats fat in the granaries at Hayford. I know men who can make other men tell the truth while those other men still believe themselves liars. Set the prices, Arya said. If they feel fair, they will be fair. Captain Merrill took his hands off the table and put them behind his back. My men are hungry, he said, as if stating a weather blessing, as if the hunger belonged to everyone who could not pay not to feel it. Hungry men strike with duller blades. They do worse work but bleed as much as they ever did. If you mean for order to be here when the rains come in earnest, feed them while you feed the rest. They'll eat, Arya said. Honest estimates. We are not kings who promise banquets and deliver crumbs. And the faith, the maester said mildly. They want their butchered privileges back. They always do. This time they have a new face to put on it. They call him the Mother's Bell. He rings a bell as he walks. That is his entire trick. But he hurts no one with it and everyone hears it. People follow men who carry a sound when they have none to carry themselves. Let him ring, Arya said. She remembered the silences that followed bells. But the faith militant will not rise again. That we will make law. No swords for the 7. They can pray in peace and eat their soup and tend the sick, and we will thank them and leave them to it. We will leave them the poor, and the poor will decide if they want to be left. They will complain, the maester said. Quill will remind them what debts they owe, Arya said. Quill nodded. As if debt were a language, she spoke like a mother tongue. There is the Iron Bank, she said. A letter inside a letter. They say they will send an envoy. They say they respect the crown no matter the head. They say that the head must respect the tally. They remind us that kings may die and crowns may be a little more mortal than pride allows. The sums are, detections of sums make a dull story when the numbers are too high to imagine. Here is the part you need. They will want a taste. They will want to see if your pulse is strong. They will put 2 fingers to your throat and press. How will you receive them? In a room, Arya said. With no corners and 1 door. I will hear them. I will tell them what they can expect her. And I will tell them that if they try to press too hard, there is a room with no doors at all where people sleep long. But I will be polite about it. I know how to be polite to Bravosi. I know how to listen when people think they are outwitting me. Omero inclined his head half a degree. It is a pleasure to watch you learn our tricks. I learned them before you, from someone who never called them tricks, Arya said. If you've come to teach me, you will leave disappointed. If you've come to be useful, you may leave with all your fingers. He smiled the same quick smile and looked everywhere and nowhere. They went on that way for some time, chewing facts and spitting out orders. Arya did not like meetings. She liked movement. But a city did not move as a single person moved. You could not pull it by the hand or shove it by the shoulder and hope it would do what you meant. You said a word here and another there and watched them go out like small boats in a wind. And some boats capsized and some made for shore and brought back something unexpected. When the maester said that the glass candles of the citadel could teach men to see further than their own gate if the citadel had any interest in teaching such things, she did not say out loud that she had watched men leave for the citadel with the light in their eyes and return with all their light bottled up in clever rules. The maester knew what she had not said and did not mind. He preferred the honest stench of a sewer problem. They were done by noon, and the small nobles who had crept back to the city now that the killing was mostly over were predictable as pigeons. They wanted reassurance that the crown would protect their little holdings and return all their old little rights. They were thin as soup at the edges and well-fed at the belly. Arya told them that rights did not disappear, but sometimes they had to be taught to behave. She told them she would not hang a man for stealing bread if his children were hungry. She told them if they wanted fewer thieves, they could begin by carrying a smaller purse and a larger basket of food to the market. She watched their faces as the words found them. Some tightened, one or two bent. She wondered which would stiffen again the moment they left the hall. She gave the afternoon to the city the way she liked. She left by a side stair and went through rooms that had not seen a brush in years. A boy with a crooked tooth and a broken shoe tried to follow her. She let him and then vanished in a turn of corridor and watched him go past bewildered. She had worn too many faces to forget how to shed a shadow. In a chamber with a narrow window that looked like a slit in a helmet, she paused and had some bread and cheese and a cup of watered wine they called Red Keep wine, and which was mostly memory and vinegar. She ate standing up and listened for the voices of the keep. The wind in the stone, the clink of a pot in a distant kitchen, a dog that barked and stopped. She went out by the postern that opened on to the Kingswood path, and there she found them, as she had guessed she would. The wolves. Not all of them, only two, and not close. They stood still as shadows among the trees where the path widened into a patch of leaves and thistles. They did not lower their heads or wag or bare their teeth. They watched her as if she were an animal to be weighed and named. She breathed in and held the breath and then let it out slow, and in that breath was a thought that had no words. The larger wolf flicked an ear. The smaller one took a step, then another, then stopped as if reminded of the rules wolves keep for themselves. In her belly she felt the old tug, the one that came in dream and in snow. She did not reel it in. She let it pull and held fast. "Not here," she whispered. "Not today." The larger wolf turned and went back into the trees. The smaller followed. The leaves closed. She stood a little longer, until the muscles in her calves began to quiver and the wind carried the smell of something that had been dead 3 days, and she wrinkled her nose and smiled the small, private smile she had when no one else was near. Then she went down to the city. The streets complained of feet, carts and donkeys and men with poles. A woman with arms roped by lifting stones. Children who moved like wind-blown paper. The smell of fish drew a line from the mud gate up into the market, and Arya stepped over that line as if it were a chalk mark in a yard game. There were casks and crates, and men who swore and men who sang rude songs with no tunes because they were too busy to find notes. She pulled her cloak tighter and took off her belt and wrapped it under her clothes, and she lowered her chin and bent her back and made her body remember a slump that had got her past 100 watchmen. She was no one. She was everyone. She went looking for the man with the bell. She found him by sound. A bell cracked in a particular way. The crack made an echo of its own, and the echo made it feel like 2 bells were ringing slow, one after the other. She followed that doubling, and it brought her to a square where the stones had been scorched and were now clean. Men of the faith stood in a row with their hands together in front of their chests, fingers pressed upward like the spires of a broken castle. Behind them the mother's bell paced back and forth and rang and smiled and rang and smiled. He was not old and not young, which was to say he was old enough to know what to do with the eyes that watched him and young enough not to be bowed by the watching. He had a narrow mouth and a softer voice than she expected. "Bread," he said, and rang again. "Bread for the Lord's children. Bread for the ladies. Bread in memory of the Father." The words were a braid. People brought him loaves in shame and pride by turns. He handed them onward to a woman with a ledger and a girl with a scar along her throat and eyes that saw everything. Elo, okayed like a man who had discovered his part in a play and intended to deliver it to a full house. Arya watched him ring and speak and ring. He did not look like a zealot. He looked like a man who had learned that if your hands made a certain motion and your voice struck a certain note, people felt their fear ease and they would step nearer to hear the ease again. He was useful. Useful people were dangerous. She went away with the taste of his sound in her mouth and thought she would let him ring for now, in daytime, with a ledger visible and a girl with a scar to keep him honest. If he rang at night, in secret, in alleys, she would hear that too. There were ears that would tell her. This city was full of them if you paid the right coin and used the right names. The ragpicker queen's eyes lit when Arya told her of the bell. "He makes a sweet sound," Quill said dryly. "We'll see if he makes an honest one. I can tell the difference by now between a saint and a thief. They use the same voice, but one has better shoes." "What do thieves sound like?" Arya asked. "Hungry," Quill said. "Like everyone, except the sated who sound bored. Bored men are worse than hungry ones. They stab because they have nothing better to do. Give them something difficult to carry and they'll stop stabbing because their hands get full." She set men and women at watching stations along the markets. Not to punish, but to count. Everything would be counted for a while. Counting was a way to make a city feel its bones. People complained that everything had gone by weight and measure once, too. They would complain now, and then beware the day they forgot to complain. By evening, a summer storm shouldered its way up the river. The sky peeled itself into layers, and each layer was a different gray. When the first fat drops slapped the dust, the smell rose up at once, a green smell that made the city weak for a heartbeat. Arya turned her face to it and let it wash her of all the hands she had shaken and all the things she had not done. She took that breath and then went back to the hall. There, as promised, they brought the man with the scales. He had the good boots, yes, and the smooth hands of a man who kept them good by making sure others did rough work. He had a conciliatory mouth and a way of putting words together so that they were true in the worst way, which is to say they arranged facts so that everything bad sounded inevitable and everything good sounded like a mistake. "You must understand," he said, his head bent toward his own shoulder in apology to the air, "that we cannot allow the poor to have the privileges of the highborn without exposing them to vices they were not bred to bear. Such as grief," Arya said, "and love, and dignity." He tried to smile. "Such as expense, which is the other name for dignity." She told him the story of a girl named Lena and a boy named Vic. She watched his face carefully. Without warning him, she asked, "How many teeth do I have?" He blinked. She smiled, showing them. "You have looked at my mouth 36 times since we have spoken." "How many?" "If you cannot say, then say you do not look at people at all." He said he did not look at people. That was good, at least, because it was true. She told him he would count their teeth from now on. He would count their toes. He would count their dead and their births, and he would write them down. He would keep no more scales. She gave the scales to the girl Lena. Lena lifted them with both hands and looked at Arya's face as if she were reading a complicated sentence and finding that it made sense after all. "You will not be allowed ash," Arya told the man with the good boots. "Not even if you become poor enough to merit mercy. I am not merciful to men who forget faces. Go do the work I have given you. If you turn aside, the wolves will find you." She said it mild, almost as if she were remarking on the weather. The hall went very quiet. Sometimes it was good to let the quiet sit like a stern ant. People learned from it. By the time the lamps were lit and the storm had passed, she finally climbed the steps. The plain chair looked up at her. The iron behind it rustled in the wind. She had not wanted to sit when the hall was full. She wanted to sit when it was empty, when the sound of her own breathing would find the edges of the room. She put one hand down and felt the roughness of a weld and thought of the smith who had made it, long dead and never named. Then she turned and, with a small, economical movement, sat the way she sat a horse the first time she had to ride one that bit. The throne pressed against her shoulder blade through the cloak. A point nipped her earlobe, not enough to draw blood, but enough to promise future attentions. She did not smile. She did not scowl. She let her face be the mask she had learned to wear in temples and kitchens and ghost hours. She was Arya of Winterfell, and she was no one, and she was a queen sitting in a chair that had harmed many before her and would harm many after. She let that be true for a while without saying it in her head. And in that wordless time she saw a procession of faces move like fish beneath the surface of a river. Cersei with her tired green eyes hard as stone at the bottom of a well. Euron laughing in a hailstorm, his mouth red with someone else's blood. The sand-eyed Prince of Dorne with his head bent to hear a whisper that had not been a whisper at all but a promise. The old lady of the Reach whose hands smelled of apples even when all the apples had rotted in their baskets. Gendry, with his big hands and his open face and his generosity that had been a shelter. His death had not been a death like the others because it asked her to forgive herself afterward, and forgiveness was harder than a list. She had not forgiven. The list had grown thinner. She had not forgiven, and that made the bones of her face feel different when she looked in a mirror. She had done it. A year of moving between faces like blades and between borders like a cat between alleys. The last of the Lannisters had looked at her as if she were a ghost telling an old joke. He had not begged. Some had. The taste of fear in a room was like vinegar on your tongue. You could smell it, taste it, it got into your clothing. The Tyrell boy had cried and told her he had loved flowers and never wanted war. She had told him that wanting never stilled any hand that had been raised, and that sometimes innocence was merely inexperience. The Dornish girl had grinned and lunged and bled out quickly, almost grateful to be done with a story that had never fit her shoulders. The Greyjoy who had rutted on the decks of stolen ships had died with a laugh, and she had watched the laugh crumple. The Arryn cousin had fallen downstairs because a shadow knocked his knee the wrong way at the wrong moment. Accidents required planning to be honest accidents. The Vale had murmured and looked at the mountain with a new fear that felt like an old one. She had made it all happen quickly, the way you put out oil fires before they run into the floorboards. You did not let rival houses endure if endurance meant a wheel rolling back over the bones of the small. She had not kept tallies on any parchment you could show to a saint. She had kept them in the meat of her back where faces came at night to ask her if she was done yet. She had said, "Nearly, nearly." Now she sat in the chair that had prescribed all the doing. "Your Grace," said the wind. Or maybe it was a servant who had crept in to light another lamp. The words sounded like leaves rubbing together. In the morning she would have to answer a letter from Winterfell. Sansa wrote rarely, and when she did the words were careful, and each careful word was a kind of trust wrapped in wadding so the journey wouldn't break it. The North would be the North, and if it did not want to be anything else than the South, which was everything else, must learn to live with absence. Arya did not want to break Winterfell. She would break her own hand first. She had broken it once, after all. A training break, a purposeful wrong. She flexed her fingers now and they were fine. She would not write anything tonight. Tonight she would only sit and let the chair press into her shoulder blade where her heart's beat could find it. A knock sounded at the side door, the one near the dais that had a hinge with a chirp. She lifted a hand and the captain opened it. A boy came in with a tray. Arya had seen him once before, carrying a similar tray with similar fear. She waved him to set it down and be off. He lingered. The tray held a bowl of broth with a little grease on top, flat bread, a piece of cheese hard enough to chalk a door. The boy's mouth opened. He looked much like Vic had looked in death, Arya thought, and shook the thought away like a moth. "Say it," she said. "My aunt says she knows where the old tunnels are." The boy blurted. "She says the bad men go in them. She says it's not right for good people to let them have the dark to themselves." "What's your aunt's name?" Arya asked. "Rella. Tell Rella she'll have a sack of good candles and a reward if she shows a map, even a crooked one. Tell her her name will be known to me, which is worth more than coin to some, and to others is a worry. Tell her to decide which she is." The boy ducked his head, dropped a clumsy bow, and nearly dropped the tray when he realized he had already put it down. He went. Arya drank the broth and did not notice if it was good. She would send Merrill and 2 of his better men to see Rella. She would go perhaps with another face, the one with the mouth that drooped, perhaps, or the one with the scar that made men look where she wanted because they were ashamed of looking at the scar. She would have to keep those faces oiled. They dried if left too long. That night she slept on a pallet brought into a chamber near the throne room, the old chamber where king's cats had once had their kittens. She laid the cloak aside and took off the laces of her jerkin and set needle on 2 pegs, the way a carpenter rests his favorite chisel. She dreamed as she always did. The dreams were a braid of snow and salt, wolves and bells. Sometimes the bells rang in the snow and left no footprints. Sometimes the wolves came up out of the sea shaking water from their fur, and the water turned to coins as it fell. In the morning the Braavosi envoy came, not Omero but the official one, the one who had the smell of dustless ledgers. He had hair so smooth it might have been oiled with melted tin, and hands with 3 rings and a fourth that had a faint line where a ring had been and was now gone. He bowed in a way that bespoke of an expensive tutor. He called himself Steward Maris, which was not his name. "You wear the crown," he said mildly. "I wear a chair," Arya said. "And a city. The city is heavier than the chair. Cities can be lightened by coin," he said. "If coin is well applied. Coin can be lightened by cities," she said, and watched him to see if he would find that amusing. He did. She knocked the amusing expression off his face with a sentence about the debt, its size, and the fact that she did not consider it a moral document. He replaced the expression with one that said he was listening. He was good. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he said, "Yes, and no, and perhaps this." And she replied, "Yes, and no, not that. And do you know how to hold an oar?" The question made him blink. That pleased her. "What I mean is this," she said. "We'll pay. We'll pay in work and in grain and in interest that does not bleed us white. We'll pay in manners, too. You'll be treated well here. You'll be allowed to speak and to count. But your counting will not be the only counting. There's a new ledger being kept. Italy's stables rebuilt and gutters cleared and boys who don't steal today because they are too tired from honest work. Italy's fewer women cheek scarred by men who think scars improve obedience. That ledger does not translate easily into coin you can tally. Perhaps in a year you'll be clever enough to tell me what it's worth. Then in a year I will come," he said, "and you may send for a sea wind to blow in my face. You are very sure you'll still have one," she said, and he did not blanch, which meant he would probably still have one. Omero watched this with interest and bowed when she dismissed the envoy. He looked like a man who had just watched another man cross a plank over a deep river and found himself wanting to try the plank to see if he could cross it faster. "Bravos prefers debts to be chains that can be confessed in polite company," he observed. "Then we will carry them in public, where everyone can see who holds the links," Arya said. "That way the city can learn who to push into the river if the chain tightens." She went out into the day then, because it was full of work that would not be done by talking. There were tunnels with bad men in them and tunnels with good men who had had bad luck. There were caches of grain that no one admitted to having and kitchens that needed hands to stir the pot. Arya stirred when she had to. She had learned to keep a simmer from a boil. She also went to the training yard and watched the men of the city watch swing their clubs. They were swordsmen, some of them, but she wanted clubs because clubs did not make orphans the way swords did, and they were good for breaking knees. You took a man's knees and he thought long and hard about drawing steel next time. She made them practice breaking and binding and carrying. She had Meryl fetch 3 women from the markets who knew how to shame a man with a word and had them teach the watch to shame men before striking them. The classes went badly at first. The watchmen did not like being scolded. They liked being laughed at even less. She let them stew. Then she singled out a lad with shoulders like a young ox and told him to shame her. He tried. She smiled and he blushed and stumbled and got better. The women laughed at him and with him, and by the end the watchmen were laughing too, ruefully, like men who had been beaten fair in the street and knew they had earned the bruises. In the second week, a fire ate a lane behind the street of flour. It was not the first, and it would not be the last, but this one bit deeper. Flames leapt the space between houses the way a cat leaps between 2 walls and then scuttled under the eaves for the pure joy of it. Men formed lines with buckets and boys climbed ladders with wet sacks to slap over windows. Arya climbed a ladder herself when the ladder wobbled under a man who had never been high before, and she crouched on a roof with her hair stuck to her forehead and a wet sack heavy across her shoulders and listened to the fire speak. It spoke quickly, with surprise at being given so much to devour and annoyance at being interrupted. She did not speak back. You didn't argue with a fire. You gave it somewhere else to go and you blocked the places it wanted. When the lines faltered, she cursed in a way old men recognized and stopped to grin at, as if their own mothers had said those same words to stop them fighting in the yard. The fire went out with a hiss like a gossip cut off mid-sentence. Afterward she walked through the steam and ash, shoes slipping in the slops, and she touched the char of a door and then the wet stone of the hearth inside. She did not make any speeches. The smoke stuck to her skin. When she returned to the keep, Quill looked at her black face, raised one brow and said, "That's one way to collect taxes. Another way is to stop smelling like this," Arya said. "If your grace did that, we'd all have a harder time remembering you've no patience for perfumes," Quill said, and tossed a wet cloth into Arya's hands. Letters came each day. Some letters had red wax, some had white, some were sealed with bits of pitch because wax was dear. Arya read them at night by lamplight and sometimes by candlelight because she liked the way a candle allowed the flame to be held close to a word. The letter from Winterfell was thin and heavy at once. Sansa's hand was precise and pretty, and each letter looked like it could feed itself from a small plate if necessary. "Sister," it began, "which tasted like snow and bark and a hearth when you have been walking all day. We are safe. We are stubborn. We bear. The North is a house that chooses its own rooms and shuts its doors when the wind howls in a certain way. You have done what you said you would do. You have taken a chair and you have put your hand on a city and told it to stand up. I do not know if I would have asked the price you asked. Perhaps that is why the asking fell to you. I do not write to argue with the dead. I write to ask you to be careful with the living. Be careful with yourself. There will be a second price. There always is." The words made Arya smile and want to put her forehead on the table at the same time. She wrote back on a scrap of vellum Quill had acquired by trading a set of forks to a man who had never owned forks and who would eat with his hands and be glad of it. "Sister," Arya wrote, "I am careful. The wolves come to the trees beyond the gate. I sometimes think they listen for your step. Tell me if the godswood is quiet. Tell me if the dead speak there still or if they have gone to ground deeper for a season." She sealed the letter with wax that had stuck to the mouth of a wine bottle and then to the bottom of Quill's pocket. She sent it with a trustworthy writer and a second letter in different words and a different hand sent under a different name in case anyone along the way wanted to read a letter addressed to a queen more than they wanted to deliver it. Letters were faces too. They had to travel masked to arrive whole. It might have been a peaceful fortnight. Had not the Vale sent a little envoy with large ideas, and the Ironborn sent a ship with small ones, and the Dornish sent a basket of oranges with 2 knives and a poem underneath them. The poem was dreadful in a way that made the corners of Arya's mouth twitch. It promised a prince who had not yet tasted defeat and who knew the taste of salt as well as the taste of dates. Promised a banner with a new color. It promised a child of a dragon and a storm, but those lines had been written once and another and another. Poetry was a fever that went through the southern kingdoms when they were bored. "Shall we answer in verse?" Quill asked. "I can rhyme when I have to. I can also put a fish in their envoy's bed and see if he rhymes after 3 days." "Answer with a charter," Arya said. "Send it to Sunspear and to everywhere else. Rights for traders. Safety for travelers. No tolls that aren't counted with a voice from our side of the fence. Invite them to count with us. Invite them to count our dead, too, and see if they stomach the number." The Ironborn ship came at night and tried to slip past the chain that no longer rose from the water. Arya had told the harbor men to string ropes and hide them and ring bells when the ropes caught a hull. The bells rang. Torches bloomed along the quay like summer flowers all at once. Captain Merrill sent men with clubs down the plank, and they clubbed and bound and dragged 7 of the Ironborn onto the pier. The 7th spat and laughed, and the laugh made warm flecks on the cheek of the man who had been closest to her. "I was a thrall once," she said. "At least with you I won't be thrown from a bridge for entertainment." "Then you won't mind rowing," Arya said. "We need our boats mended." The Vale envoy had the look of a man who wants to impress his father and only knows a limited set of methods. He wanted to talk about noble lines. Arya wanted to talk about roads. He had never thought about roads, except as a thing to move chairs across when chairs had to be moved. Arya took him to a place near the King's Gate where stones had sunk and water pooled, and a cart always got stuck there on rainy days. It had rained in the night. She made him help push. He pushed badly and learned quickly, and at the end he had mud on his hands and in his boots, and he was grinning because he had not died. "You are very strong," he said, as if that were a line he had been given to say. She did not tell him that strength had little to do with it. She told him that if the Vale wanted its tolls collected, then Vale men needed to be in the counting houses. And if they wanted their road safe, then they would send men with clubs, not swords. And if they wanted to know whether their corn came back as honest coin, they would open their purses here and let her hand count too. He found that funny. He laughed. He went away with his ring finger bare because he had bet it on his ability to guess how many stones had to be dug out of a particular puddle to let it drain. He had guessed wrong. He gave her the ring and told her to keep it for luck. She did. In the 3rd month, the murders began. Not the old murders, which were as regular as tides. A drunk who fell and cracked his head on a step. A quarrel between 2 men over a woman who went away with neither. The quiet suffocation of a baby that had been too weak to hold its breath against the world. These were different. These were a pattern with a bad rhythm. They left no blood, but they left a mark. They found the first in a house by the street of Silk. The woman on the bed looked like a doll that had been folded wrong. Her neck had been tugged into a shape it did not want. Her eyes were wide and her tongue lay behind her teeth like a slug afraid of daylight. There were 2 long hairs on the pillow that did not belong to her. They were pale hairs. The second was a city official who had grown rich settling sewer disputes and had settled them too often in favor of men with clean hands. He lay slumped against his desk. Coin was in his mouth. It had a nick on it in the shape of a crescent moon. The third was a boy in the market who had shouted that he hated the queen and that the queen should die, and someone had agreed in such a quiet way that he had stopped talking and started dying. Arya stood in each of those rooms and did not speak for a long time. The silence spoke for her. Said, "Here." Said, "Look." Said, "There is another hand in your city that knows how to make a body rest without complaining." She tasted her anger and then spat it out because anger clouded the eyes. She thought of the house of black and white. She thought of the coin Jaqen had given her and the tithe she had paid in a name. She went to the weir, where the water ran sluggish now with summer, and she sank her hands in up to the wrist and spoke out loud for the first time to the old gods since she had taken the chair. "I have killed enough," she said. "If this is the price for killing enough, then let me pay it with eyes open." The water was warm as blood. A fish brushed her knuckles and darted away. Quill came and stood with her. "Do you think it's Bravos?" she asked. "Do you think they've sent you a reminder that you were theirs once?" "I was never theirs," Arya said. "No more than I belong to this chair. I used the house and the house used me. That's all. No god owns me." "Well," Quill said, "if a god wants to pretend otherwise, I have a sack for him." They found that the coin with the nick had been used recently at a tavern called the Mother's Splinter, and before that had paid for a pound of nails from a smith who had a scar along his forearm from having put it in the wrong place when he was 14. The coin came into Arya's palm and lay there like a cold eye. She kept it. She asked Omero if he had felt a wind. He said he had felt winds of various kinds. He had felt an east wind on the west side of a street. He had felt a wind that came down a well. He had felt a wind that came from his own sleeve when his hand moved too fast. "Does your sleeve have a god in it?" Arya asked. "Sometimes," he said, "but only on feast days." They watched the tunnels. They put eyes in the bathhouses, not to catch people at their ease, but to see the people who entered with a certain stride and left with a certain lightness that meant the doing had been done. They listened to the bell. They counted the dead and tallied the tallies and drew lines between them. The lines connected and did not connect, and then one night, in a cellar under a house where spices were stored and the last of the perfume of summer apricots clung, Arya met a face she had known too well. Not a face she had worn. That was the trouble. A face that had looked at her across a stone floor and spoken to her in a tone that implied that she was always almost ready to learn if she would only be quieter. A face that belonged to a woman whose steps made no sound and whose hands looked rough until they touched you, and then they were soft as the inside of your own wrist. The woman did not wear the same face, because all faces had been different depending on the light. But the feeling of her face was the same. She had no smell. She had no weight on the stairs. She had a kindness that felt like the smooth part of a knife. "You shouldn't have come," Arya said softly. She held Needle at her side. She did not move into a guard. She stood and let the space between them do its own work. "You left the house," the woman said. "You left with less than you owed. The many-faced god does not count in coin, but nevertheless there is a sum." "I paid," Arya said. I paid and paid. These crowns? She touched the iron behind her with a nod of her head. These chairs, these names. How many do you need to be satisfied? The god has had his fill through my hand. If he wants more, let him come and ask. He will not find me polite if he comes to tax me again. The god does not need politeness, the woman said. He requires balance. He requires no more than he requires. What is the number? Arya asked. I like numbers. Quill has taught me. If I must settle, give me a sum. If you want my throat, say so. I won't beg. I never liked begging. It made my mother's knuckles ache. She would swat us and then kiss the swat, and we would all pretend that hurt less. How many names have you taken since leaving the house? The woman asked. Arya smiled without teeth. You have a better ledger than I do. Count them yourself. If I tell you the number, you'll think I'm trying to impress you. I'm not. I'm bored with being impressive. I want to mend sewer pipes and shame men out of stabbing each other over a slice of goat. There was a small silence. Then the woman tilted her head, a fraction of a fraction, and it was the gesture that had once made Arya's stomach tighten with instruction that was not a threat and not a threat. The god does not mind if you mend sewers, the woman said. He approves of mending. He will accept that kind of piety. But the balances must be kept when you pretend kingship. There are still names to remove. There are men who will undo what you have done and make a worse version of it. There is a boy with pale hair. There is a prince with a song that is almost good. There is a ship with painted eyes that believes itself a living thing. Arya's mouth went dry. Names, she said. Give them. We do not speak names in alleys, the woman said. We do not give them to people who will use them as toys. You cannot unlearn play once you have learned it. You know this. I also know, Arya said, that when you leave a house, you build another. I have built one here. If you walk in and begin deciding where to put the cups, you will find my hands on yours. Do you understand? The woman's eyes moved just enough for Arya to feel the change in the air. A girl speaks like a queen, she murmured. It might have been a compliment. It might have been a warning. The woman moved. Arya moved. The seller breathed a sigh like a distracted parent. They did not strike. They did not embrace. They went apart and then toward each other and then apart again like two cats testing weather. In the end, the woman turned first and went into the dark without leaving a footstep. Arya waited until the smell of apricots returned. Balance, she said. Then I will invent my own balance and make the god learn it. She went above and breathed in the street. She found Quill and told her to open a new account book, a very private one that would count not coin but people with pale hair and ships with painted eyes and songs that were almost good. Quill did not like ambiguous assignments. They made her frown. She fanned herself with the empty ledger. We will need more pages, she said, for songs alone. They were in the hall when the next envoy came. This one wore Valley's green. He had been riding hard. Sweat had cut bright runnels through the road, dust on his cheeks. He bowed, and his bow had desperation in it, which was a kind of honesty Arya preferred to silk. A raven from the Eyrie, he said, and fumbled the knot on the message and could not undo it. And Merrill reached out with one blunt hand and undid it as if undoing a child's shoe. Arya read words that said the mountain was in motion. Not the stone of it, but the men. Bands. Old banners pulled out of chests. Once rivals now returned to the Vale with their stomachs lined in leather and their shoulders grown crooked from sleeping under debt. A dozen minor lords who hated one another had broken bread and made a pact not to hate one another for a season. They had a cause. Causes were worse than hunger. Causes could be fed anything. They mean to come down, the envoy said when he had breath to say more. They mean to take the city in the king's name. In whose king's name? Quill asked, flipping the ledger open to a page that had a list of names she had not yet decided W. Heir enemies or assets? Their own, the envoy said, and that was a good answer. People were always worst in their own names. They killed more purely that way. Arya nodded as if a puzzle piece had clicked. We will meet them on ground that suits us, she said. We won't wait for them to come here. We are not a hearth to be invaded by sparks. Captain Merrill lifted an eyebrow. How many do they count, Your Grace? Enough, Arya said, and did her own quick tally in her head. How many clubs? How many men who could march a day and not complain? How many carts for stones? How many torches? How many women who could work a sling? How many wolves she could call to the tree line? How many bells in the city would ring in rhythm to make men march with a swagger because the beat turned their knees into anchors? In the days that followed, a great deal of small, careful work got done quickly. That was how you made speed. You did not gallop. You did not shout. You sent 3 boys to count every stone at a place where the road narrowed. You sent 2 girls to sit on a roof and signal with thread if men moved beneath them in a way that felt like a line rather than a scatter. You had Kul go to the counting houses and make speeches about patriotism that sounded exactly like speeches about profit. You had Merrill walk through the barracks and stare at each man long enough to make him shuffle his feet and resolve to keep them cleaner. You had Omero lay his quiet hands on oars and on ears and whisper a particular rumor in the right bars. That the city would pay a gold piece for each enemy who would rather go home than die for a cause he did not understand. Such gold had to be visible. You kept a strongbox open on a table all day like a fish with its mouth agape, and you let people see you put coins in and take coins out. Money had to breathe to be believed. Before dawn on a day that would later be remembered by innkeepers as good for business and by widows as the first day they understood how much a twice-made bed could hurt, Arya rode out with the city at her back. She wore no crown. She wore a plain helm that fit, a neck guard that did not pinch, and leather that did not squeak. At her side was a boy of 15 with a sling and a girl of 12 with a longer tongue than a cat. Behind her came men with clubs, women with knives tucked into their belts, bakers who smelled of hot bread and swore like pirates. She had sent a message to Sansa the night before that read only, "We go. Watch the trees. If the leaves fall early, send word." They met not far from the place where the King's Road bent like a bow. The Vale men had banners that caught the light and flung it back like insults. They had horses. They had men whose laces were tied well. Arya had slopes and stones and a wind at her back. She had taught herself not to smile when she had those. She almost failed to keep a straight face. She went down among the fighters with a bucket and a ladle. She poured water into cupped hands, into helmets, into mouths. She told a joke that had no end because it wasn't funny. It was a rhythm. When the first Vale arrow fell short, she said nothing. When the second found a shoulder and made a man cry out with a voice like a goose, she grimaced because pain deserved respect. When the third flew high, she said, "Now!" And her slingers stepped forward and their pebbles began to make their small, sturdy music against shields and helmets. A horse stumbled on a stone that had been left like a trap where stones gather of their own accord. A rider swore in a way that said he loved his horse more than the man who had told him where to ride. The first rush came, broke, reformed. Men are water. You set something sturdy in their path and train them to let themselves break and come again, and if they will not learn, then they drown. Arya walked. She did not ride once the line met. She moved among the clubs and the knives and the hands that shook. If a man faltered, she touched his back. If a woman was jostled, she put herself at her right shoulder for a while and then moved on. When a foe came too close, she pricked him somewhere he would remember. Under the arm, inside the thigh, a place that would ache in the night and sing in the morning. Needles sang lightly. She did not have to make it sing loud. The song went along the line and people found their breath. It was not a beautiful contest. Beauty had nothing to do with it. It was not even particularly bloody as these things go. Clubs and stones made bruises that later flowered like bad roses and made men swear to their wives that they had fought dragons. The Vale men were brave, and that was the problem. Brave men died when they should have turned and taken their valors home with them. Some did turn. Quill's gold mouth lay open back in the city, inviting. Enough turned. Enough dropped their weapons and put their hands up and looked around as if to say, "Wait, where is the song that was almost good that was supposed to carry us?" It had failed them. Someone had told them the rhythm and then missed the beat. Arya looked for the man who had counted them into the music and found him falling from his horse, not because anyone had struck him, but because his horse had stumbled over a road fix that had been intentionally made sloppy. Horses recognized lies before men gave them names. At noon, when men start to lose themselves if you don't give them a place to hang their eyes, Arya took off her helm and went to the front and stood with her hair stuck to her temples and looked at the Vale men still in front of her and said one sentence. You can come down in peace and we will feed you and send you home with a coin and a bruise, or you can come down in pieces and be burned on a pyre with no one to say your name. The sentence was not a poem. It did not have to be. To put two bowls before them and ask them to take one. Most chose the first. Some chose the second because men like to be meat for causes. Indeed, it is hard to stop them when the cause has put its hand in their chest. For those men she said a word afterward under her breath because you had to say something or the night got louder and louder and you could not sleep with that much noise. By evening they had a line of men going back toward the Vale with coin in their pockets and stitches in their heads. They had a wagon with broken wheels because the man who owned it was a fool who never oiled them, and behind it a line of women who had come to bring their husbands home and had found them earlier than they had feared. Arya sat on a stone and took off her boots and rubbed the places where the straps had cut. Her feet were strong and the skin was rough and the nails cut short. A girl of 12 sat down beside her and imitated the gesture, cutting her nails with a small blade with too much force and nearly bleeding. Arya did it for her. You will learn to be less angry with yourself, she said. It will happen slowly and then all at once. The night after that she dreamed of the house again, but this time it was full of windows. People looked in through the windows and then walked away. When she woke, the first thing she did was go to the god's wood that was not a wood at all. Not here, but an old courtyard where a single sapling stood in a barrel of earth a man named Hatch had dragged down from the crownlands because he liked the way the red leaves whispered. How that sapling had lived, no one pretended to know. Arya put her palm on its smooth bark and felt a coolness go up her arm and into the small bones. I would put a real tree here, she said low. I would make a place for it to put its roots. It would be said later that the queen had broken the king's sept to plant a tree. She did not break it. It had been broken by men who had loved themselves too much to love anything else. She only cleared the broken stone, and she ordered earth brought, and she stood and watched as men and women dug. Her hands blistered against the handle of the shovel, and she was pleased to see the blisters. They were proof of time spent. Music came from the city then, the old songs and the new ones that had stumbled to their feet. The mother's bell rang not far off, and the sound did not sour the music. On a balcony, a singer lifted a lyre and found a tune that was new and honest and would be hummed by women washing clothes for years because it fit a rhythm of ringing and beating and lifting. Arya stopped and listened. She did not know the words yet. She hummed under her breath. The day the tree went into the ground, rain fell again. A steady raining that found its way through old cracks and new ones. The sapling's leaves trembled. The bark glistened. People came to touch it, as gently as you touch the hand of someone who has been ill. The mother's bell came and rang once, twice, and then held the bell under his arm and bowed, and Arya nodded in return. The ragpicker queen stood with her hands on her hips and looked as if she had built the tree herself out of coins found in gutters. Omero watched with his hands hidden and his eyes visible. Merrill looked like a man who had been given a beautiful thing to defend and was afraid that his hands would be crude. The maester had a new stain of earth on his chain. Beginnings, he said softly. They are the real weight. Endings are light by comparison. Endings float away. We will tie this one down, Arya said. We will sew stones into the hem of this beginning so it does not blow. At night in the hall she sat alone sometimes, and sometimes not. Sometimes she sat while people came and spoke and went, and she gave them what she could and could not give them what she could not. Sometimes she sat and did not speak at all, because silence had work to do. She listened for footsteps in places where footsteps did not belong. She listened for the shape of a breath on her neck. She listened for wolves far away. When letters came from the north, she put her face to them, as if they carried a smell she could use as a map. When letters came from the reach, she folded them carefully because their sentences were fat with butter and it made them tear. News came that a small boy with pale hair had been seen near Fairmarket, learning how to count change without looking down. News came that the Iron Bank envoy had sent word to his masters that the Queen of the South could read a ledger upside down and pick a liar's number out of a column like a cat plucking a bird out of hedgerow. News came that the song that was almost good had improved. It had found a chorus that made men forget the poverty of the verses. News came that ships with black sails and painted eyes had been seen out past Driftmark, rocking on the swell in a way that suggested they were listening to the water for a name. "Let them listen," Arya said. "Let the water speak to them until their bones chill and their teeth chatter. We will put another bell on the quay so their knees knock in rhythm with our counting." Quill laughed, then stopped and pointed with her chin at the doors. "You have a visitor," she said. "And this one carries his face like it's the first thing he ever owned." A man entered with his hat in his hands. He was not noble, or if he was, he had lost his title in a card game and did not mourn it. He had the look of a fisherman who had learned to read and now regretted several years of net mending because books had made his fingers itch for something else. He came and bowed badly and lifted his head too quickly. "Your Grace," he said, and the words took their shoes off to walk in the hall. "What do you ask?" Arya said. "I ask nothing for myself," he said. "I ask you for a story, a true one, for my boy." He asked why the Queen's hair is dark and why her face looks like it's been in the weather. He asked why the Queen's hands look like they have touched stone. I told him queens are made of anything there is in a city. He said that queens are made of gold. I said, "Not this one." So I want a story to tell him. Something that will sit in his belly. Arya made a face, then smoothed it. She did not tell many stories. Stories had a way of becoming truth and then you were stuck with them. But a boy had asked. Boys were owed debts more often than they were paid them. She thought of a story that could be told without spilling anything that would rot in the air. "When I was a girl," she said, "I let a cat scratch me because I did not know how to hold it. The cat ran and my sister cried because it bled on her dress. I learned to hold the cat. Years later I held 1,000 cats and none of them scratched me. And if they had, I would have laughed. That's a story. Tell your boy that a queen's job is to hold the cat. Tell him that some days the cat purrs and some days the cat bites and some days the cat runs and makes you go looking in alleys. Tell him that if the queen comes back with hair out of place, it is only because her hand was on the cat's heart." The man stared at her, then grinned so suddenly his teeth flashed like fish. "That's a true story," he said. "I can tell it and not feel my tongue lying." He bobbed and went quickly as if he had taken more than his share and meant to put some back. "Cut," Quill said, amused. "Not a wolf." "A city is not a wolf," Arya said. "It does not hunt with you. It wants to be held." "And your hands," Quill began. "They are not gentle," Arya said, "but they are steady." Outside the windows the sky leaned closer to the hall, and the lamplight made the iron gleam like wet bark. She sat and listed names in her head and chose to forget them for a while. She let the chair prick her ear and her shoulder. She let the quiet come. The doors breathed. The earth under the sapling shifted a little as worms did their work. In the vaults beneath the city bad men hid and good men hid, and some had been given little choices and had made them unsteadily. The bell rang twice and then once and then was silent. Far away, the sea lifted and set down a black-sailed ship, and the painted eye on its prow saw nothing new, only its own name in the water. In the keep, a woman with a face like a poem that had been edited too many times walked along a corridor and paused at a corner and ran her fingertip along the stone. She did not smile, because smiling was a weight she was not required to carry when no one watched. She went on. Arya felt the breath of her passage, though the air did not move. She had enough enemies to supply a war. She had enough friends to fill a small room and make it very warm. She was not done. The city was not a story with an ending. It was a tree with stones sewn into its hem and a bell that might listen to itself when no one asked it to ring. It was a bench in a shadow where a woman with a scar counted the loaves the bell-giver brought, and if he cheated she raised her eyebrow and the cheating stopped. She sat. She closed her eyes and listened to the blood in her ears. She saw a boy with pale hair counting without looking down. She saw a letter with careful words that would arrive in her hand damp with fog from the north. She saw a ship that thought itself alive, pretending to be a thought in the mind of a woman who wore the scent of apricots and knives. She saw a mountain's edge crumble, not from siege but from thaw. She opened her eyes and the hall was the hall again, and the chair behind her a rumor in iron. She spoke once, aloud, to no one and to everyone. "I will hold you," she said. "I will hold you even if you scratch." The hall took the word and laid it carefully along the stones. And when morning came and the first petitioner stepped into that word, it felt like stepping onto a plank laid over mud. The plank held. The mud sank. The petitioner was a man who had spent his life flattering men who wore fur in winter and silk in summer, and had not yet learned how to flatter someone who came back from a fire with ash in her hair. He tried. He failed. Arya listened. She would teach him how to ask and to be answered. She had time. She had as much time as this city could give, and then the rest was borrowed, and borrowed time was the only kind worth having. Days piled. She liked the weight. She carried it as one carries a barrel, in the arms pressed close. She met the Iron Bank envoy again and told him a joke about his hair, and he laughed and then was offended and then laughed again. She sent Merrill to Vale towns with coin and no threat and watched them learn to spend pride without receipts. She set the girls of the city to learning letters by chalking prices on boards and then rubbing them out and then chalking them again in a hand that did not slant. She sat with quill late into the night and coaxed columns into lining up, and when one refused, she cocked her head and told it could sleep outside. She made a law that you could not beat your wife with anything wider than your thumb, and then she made a narrower thumb to hand out with the law so that men would learn to laugh and then to stop altogether because laughter had embarrassed them enough to change. She burned the kettles of a man who had boiled rats and told people they were chicken. She appointed a boy whose name she liked because his name had tasted like bells to be in charge of a gate. She changed her mind when he tried to keep men out because their boots were muddy. She changed him to a different gate and said, "Learn what a city looks like when it works." And he did. She made a profane oath into a blessing by saying it in the hall and then letting the hall keep it. When she could not sleep, which was not often, she went to the tree and sat and told it a single story. The story had no names. It had a child and a winter road and a loaf of stale bread and a wolf that watched. In the story, the child always arrived. In the story, there was always breath left to blow on the bread and soften its edges. Sometimes she told it through her teeth, because the gods liked stubborn children better than good ones. Sometimes she told it as a list of things that had been carried in pockets. A penny with a nick, a twist of hair, a pebble from near a river, a splinter of bone. The tree rustled. The red leaves flashed. Her breath showed like a ghost on cold nights that were not very cold because summer had not left yet. She did not ask the tree to answer. She did not like answers. They hardened and then broke. A raven came with 3 words tied to its leg. A child sung. Quill read them and frowned and said, "Poets." And Arya read them again and thought of a boy counting without looking down and felt a thread catching on a nail somewhere where she could not yet see it. Omero looked into his sleeve and said he felt a wind, but that was only because he always said that when he could not think of something clever enough to hide what he did not know. Merrill swore he would put men on the roads, and he did. The maester wrote a long letter to no one in particular about how rumors were like rats, and then he burned it because rats ate paper. The song reached the city 2 weeks later. A boy on the back of a wain had a voice like the edge of a bottle, and he sang of a prince who had never been told no and who found a way to make a no into a yes by changing the words clothes. It was a good trick, and a dangerous one, and Arya swore softly in a northern way and said, "Find him." Merrill found him and brought him in, and he trembled and tried to sing and could not because he was too close to his new subject. She gave him bread and cheese and a place to sleep. In the morning he sang better, and she took his words and folded them and returned some and kept others, and when he left the hall the song had changed. Now the prince in it was clever and brave and handsome and also a little foolish, because foolishness makes handsome men bearable. Now he had pale hair and an aunt who loved him in a way that made people uncomfortable. Now he had no horses that loved him, and it made the women in the kitchen snort with affection. Now he did not know how to swim. Without knowing it, the boy had made his subject mortal. Arya sent him away with a coin and a bruise. He went and sang in the market, and the prince began to become a man in the mouths of men who would have died for him yesterday, and now thought they would perhaps live for themselves instead. A winter wind came early that year. Leaves fell in the north sooner than they were supposed to fall according to men who believe trees should consult calendars. Sansa wrote, "Leaves." Arya read the single word and felt it in her bones the way one feels snow in the wrist. She sent a message to the Vale and said, "We have begun to count differently." She sent a message to Dorne and said, "Send your oranges if you must, but stop putting knives under them. We have our own." She sent a message to the Isles and said, "The sea is the same for all of us. Do not pretend yours is deeper." At dawn she climbed the steps again and sat this time without thinking about whether she should, because thinking makes sitting a performance and performances grow false when repeated too often. She let herself be held by the iron a little. She let herself be pricked. She drew a small pinprick of blood and let it well and thought, "Yes," and then licked it off her finger because blood dries too quickly and becomes a story you cannot recite properly. One night, much later, when the city had learned to count in a new way and forgotten how it had ever counted otherwise, she woke with a name in her mouth. It was not one of the old ones. It was not one of the ones she had worn thin with repetition until the world had thinned too. It was a new name, and she could not say whether it belonged to a man or a woman or a child. She sat up on her pallet in the room where the cats had once had their kittens, and the moonlight lay in rectangles on the stone like folded sheets. She said the name again, and the room did not answer, and the iron did not answer, and the tree rustled. She rose and went to the window that looked down at the river, where it swelled out a little before consenting to become the bay. A mist lay there that had not been there before. It was the mist of a mouth speaking without words. She put her hand on the sill. She thought of Jaqen's face and the way it had felt on her palm once when she had touched him to be sure he was solid. She thought of Sansa's letters and the way each word was a step on a path that had no puddles in it. She thought of Gendry's hands, which had been so gentle for hands that could bend iron. She thought of the wolves and the bell, and of Quill with her coin, and of Merrill with his flat ear, and of Omero with his sleeve winds, and of a boy counting without looking, and of a ship with painted eyes. She thought of Lena lifting a scale. She thought of the man with the good boots and the bad mouth as he counted teeth in the market and learned the names that matched them. She said the new name a third time, felt right in the mouth. It tasted like iron and oranges and the underside of a leaf. She smiled and let the name go out the window and into the mist with a little push of breath, as if it were a paper boat and she had given it a launch. The mist took it and folded over it and moved on. In the morning there would be petitions, and a letter that said the bank would accept a new rate if the market held and perhaps even if it did not, and a rumor that the prince had learned to swim after all but only in shallow water, and a discovery of a tunnel that led nowhere, which was precisely where it needed to lead to be useful, and an argument with the mother's bell about the volume of a bell rung at midnight, and a joke Quill would tell that would make Arya not laugh and then laugh hours later, and a new woman at the gate with a face that made men stop and think of their sisters, and the evening, always the evening with its long Patty, NT dark that did not expect her to be more than she was and did not forgive her either. She lay back down and slept until dawn, and the city woke when she did and sometimes before, and the chair waited for her and did not get up and walk away. The wolves came to the trees and rubbed their backs against the bark and left hair there, bright on the dark. A bell rang twice, then once. Far out in the bay a fish jumped and fell back and made a small sound that someone on the quay thought was a sign. In Bravos, a man poured wine and thought of debts as if they were friends. In the Vale a boy touched his bruise and smiled and thought, "I will tell my children that a queen hit me with a word." In the north a leaf fell, red as a tongue, and the snows scent edged the air. The city breathed. Arya breathed with it. She had chosen the hardest thing, to hold. She would do it as long as the holding wanted her. When it did not, when it pressed back in a way that told her to go, she would let go. But not yet. Not while the names still moved like fish in a river she had learned as a child to kneel beside. Not while the tree took water. Not while the bell rang and then was quiet and then rang again. Not while the ship with the painted eyes lifted and fell and wondered whether it would ever see what it wanted. Not while the pale-haired boy counted and forgot to look down. Not while the man with the good boots found that boots were always needing mending, and that mending had a satisfaction in it he had not suspected. Not while Quill's coins flashed like fish along a net. Not while Meryl's blunt ear turned toward steps in a place where steps did not belong. "Come," she said in the hall at noon when the doors groaned as ever, and the word was a short, useful blade that did just what it needed to do. Next, on the third morning after the mist carried her new name, the city brought her 3 kinds of trouble and wrapped them in simple cloths. A fishmonger's boy with a cut hand that would not close and a story that would not either. A message from the Riverlands sealed with cracked wax and sealed again with string because the seal had failed. And a little basket of oranges that someone had set just inside the doors, as if fruit were a petition. She took the oranges first, because the fruit would rot while a boy could be bandaged and a message could be read under a lamp after the light went. She turned an orange in her hand and felt her thumb find a soft spot where a bruise had flowered under the skin. The peel came away in a spiral. The scent shot through the hall and made even the guards' knees lighten. She handed half to Quill, who had come as always with her pockets already weighed down with sums. "Dorn," Quill said, biting, feeling poetic and hungry at once. "They sent knives under the last basket," Arya said. Quill felt in the wicker with 2 fingers and came up with a ribbon tied to a leaf. "Not even a ribbon now," she observed. "They've run low on ribbons. Or they've decided to be more honest." The fishmonger's boy held his cut hand as if it had asked him to carry it somewhere as a favor, and he had not yet been thanked. The cut had been made by a bright new knife. He had bought the knife with coin pinched from his father's apron while his father slept. He had wanted to cut fish clean. He had cut his hand instead, and his father had woken and called him fool, and then cried because he had said fool and pushed him out of the door because men did not know what to do with tears and fish in one morning. Arya washed the cut herself, with the boy watching her eyes and not his own red. "You will learn to start farther from your thumb," she said. "You will learn to keep the blade facing away from everyone. If you go on cutting yourself, I'll find you a different job. Counting teeth, perhaps. It's a good job. Hard to spill blood doing it unless you find a stubborn mouth." "I can learn," he said. He was talking about the knife and about other things he didn't know the names of yet. "See that you do." She wrapped the hand in the cloth from around the oranges. Stained at once. The boy's eyes flicked to it with superstitious dismay. She had seen that flick before in 100 different countries. People believed color made a difference to pain. Perhaps it did. She gave him a copper and told him to buy a sweet roll and then a bone needle and learn to stitch. He stared at needle against her shoulder and then at the bone needle and then at his own hand. He nodded and went. The cracked wax message had been pressed with a seal that pretended to be an eagle and was only a bird. The words inside were thick with pride and thinner with information. Men in the Riverlands had begun to gather around a boy with pale hair. The letter said that the boy had a look to him that made old men straighten up. He had a way of lowering his eyes without lowering his chin. He walked with his hands slightly behind him, as if he were waiting for a robe to be put on his shoulders. He had taken in 2 villages without drawing swords and had said gentle words and touched children's heads and made women look at him as if they were thinking of someone they had meant to marry and hadn't. The letter asked if anyone had told the queen that ghosts could have sons. "Well," Quill said, reading over her shoulder without apology. "The song has grown legs. It will trip on them if given the right stones," Arya said. She folded the letter on its crease and folded it again. "We will gather the singers before we gather the swords." Maester Kahlo arrived with a list of cisterns that had been cleaned and another of those that had not because their covers had been stolen and made into shields by men who could afford better shields. "I propose we make lids of a less useful shape," he said. "Let us provide temptation only for those who like circles very much." "Make them heavy," Arya said. "If a man lifts one for a shield, he should feel tea. He weight on his shoulder the next day when he tries to raise a cup and cannot. That's a lesson too." The day took its shape from such exchanges. A street needed stones. A guild needed shaming. A mother needed a magistrate who would not wink at a husband's hand. A ship put into the Blackwater with painted eyes on its prow, and the eyes were old paint, not new, but they looked too alive all the same. Omero came with his soft step and said it was a Myrish trader with a captain who slept with a dagger up his sleeve and had broken 3 promises but never his habit of touching his earlobe when he lied. If he seeks harbor, we will give him that and we will count his lies, Arya said. Men who sleep with a dagger up their sleeve should wake with blistered elbows. Send him to the shallows by the old chain. There's a sandbar there that will teach him humility. She watched the watch practice with their clubs under Meryl's eye and turned away only when a woman fainted cleanly and got up again with her pride intact because the girl with the scar along her throat clapped once at the right moment and caught her. She stood in the kitchens a while and ate bread that steamed and then sat in the counting room and moved a coin one column to another with her forefinger because it had been set in the wrong place and would have caused a lie if left. In the afternoon she took Quill and Meryl and Omero to the room without corners. The stonemasons had not enjoyed making it. Men who had built walls all their lives did not like a room that did not agree with their hands. It bulged, felt like a barrel and like a womb. A single door made an eye into the room and a single slit up high let in light like a precise blade. She had put the chair there for the first meeting with the Iron Bank and she put it there now and did not sit in it. She waited with her back to the bulge. They will come, Omero asked without asking. They are already in the city, Arya said. I smelled apricots in a lane where they do not sell fruit. Quill sucked her teeth. If they want to sell you balance, I have a scale for them. They won't want coin, Arya said. They will want a number of a different kind. The woman from the cellar came as if the room had been waiting for her and had called her by name. She did not bring weapons. She brought her hands and a pocket with nothing in it and the smell of nothing and the weight of nothing and all the things that made a person dangerous. She did not bow. Arya did not expect her to. They had not bowed to one another in a long time and had never meant it when they had. We have a ledger, the woman said. The column on your side has many entries. It tallies. I am not here to dispute counting. The column on ours is light. You want me, Arya said. We want a weight to set there that will still the table, the woman said. My life, Arya said. You came to take it once before. You wanted to see if I would give it or if you'd have to pull. I didn't. You didn't. We are here again and I will not give it now either. You can try to take it. You will leave with fewer hands than you brought. Don't boast, the woman said. It is unattractive in queens. I am not boasting, Arya said. I have counted the hands in this room. Yours. Mine. The ones outside. I have counted the warmth of the stone. I have counted the number of breaths it takes for a man to make himself steady after he decides to kill. I have counted how many women in this city would tear down your house if I pointed and said, there. Quill's breathing changed. Meryl did not move and did in a way that had everything to do with the strength in her wrist. Omero's eyes looked like eyes again and not like tricks. You offer instead, the woman of the house said. 2 names, Arya said. 2 true names. They will be heavy enough to still any table. They are not coins. They are sacks of grain. They are ships loaded with iron. The first is the one behind the boy with pale hair. He calls himself steward and whispers the word governance as if it were a caress. He puts paper between his intentions and his hands and believes that absolves him. If you kill the boy, another will be painted and paraded. If you end the mouth that sings into his ear, the song will stumble. The second is the reaver with the painted eyes. Not his ship, the man. He is a beast that has been fed on rage long enough to imagine it a god. He will burn 100 to make his name sound bigger in his own head. He is a weight that crushes more than it balances. The woman listened without a blink. She had taken 1,000 names and given fewer back. She tilted her head once more. Balance, she said, as if tasting a fruit bought at a poor stall and discovering it sweet enough to keep. This city, Arya said, because rage had to be sheathed in something, and balance would do, will not be your hunting ground, not while I sit, not while I stand. If you need deaths to turn your wheels, take them where the wheels are stuck by monsters. Take them at sea. Take them in richly carpeted rooms where the men who think themselves clean stain the floor with their shoes. You forbid us? The woman asked. I invite you, Arya said. To spend your god's appetite on larger hungers than mine. If you insist on forbidding me tomorrow because balance requires that we become enemies again, I will be here. I am not hiding in corners. There aren't any. The woman looked around the round room as if confirming that. She smiled once, a small slice shown and hidden. You are no one no longer, she said. That has its own honesty. We will accept the names you bring to the table. For a season. For a season, Arya said. The pairing will be this. For every noble you remove who would burn 100, 10 poor men will live. That is my sum. We keep other maths, the woman said. But we can learn a new one and see if it has its uses. She went as she had come, leaving no breath to push. The door. When she had gone, Quill let out a sound like a weight set down carefully. There, she said. We spent nothing and saved a city. We spent 2 monsters, Arya said. I have no sorrow for that expense, Quill said. If the god requires change, I'll count it out with pleasure. Meryl did not speak. Omero said, You grew your own house. I grew a room without corners, Arya said. Sometimes that's enough. By week's end a thing happened that Quill had predicted in a tone of fatal cheer years ago, though the year felt like yesterday and showed the oddness of time. The mother's bell rang after midnight. It was a single strike and then a second a long moment later, as if a thought had taken longer than usual to be fully thought. Arya woke on her pallet and went to the window and listened, and the third strike did not come at once. She pulled on boots and a cloak and went down. The square where he stood had been swept. That almost pleased her more than anything he could say. People who meant to raise a ruckus did not sweep first. The bell had something hidden and simple about him as he stood there with his bell held still. The girl with the scar stood on his right and the woman with the ledger was on his left. The ledger was closed. The page was blank. He looked at Arya and then at the tree that had begun to take to its place and then back at her. You don't sleep much, he said softly. I sleep when the city does, she said. It never does, he said. It will learn, she said. Why are you ringing at night? He swallowed, and the swallow was a thing that 1,000 men could have done, and yet it seemed singular here. Men with swords came at dusk. They had painted their wrists with oil because they meant to lift heavy things and not be cut by their own blades. They asked me to call men with clubs to join them to ring the bell. They wanted a show. You refused, Arya said. It wasn't a question because she would hear his refusal in the way the night air felt if he had rung for swords. It would be thicker. It would smell of iron and not rain. I told them that bells at midnight wake babies, he said, and that a cry from a baby makes a force in the world stronger than anything a man has at his hip. He looked sheepish then, as if he had heard his own words and found them grander than he usually allowed. I thought, perhaps, I would ring for bread even now, but bread after darkness tastes of fear. What will you ring for? Arya asked. Silence, he said, to show it can be a sound if you hold it up and tell people what to do with it. He did not ring. People stood, holding their mouths still, with a discipline she would have expected of fighters and not of wives in aprons and fruit sellers and boys invulnerable to instruction. They held their silence. It stood wearing their faces, eased her. She lifted one hand in the second minute and the silence let go of itself like a breath. The bell nodded once. I am not your enemy, he said. You could have been, she replied. That would have been a waste. They will ask me for swords again, he said. I will tell you when they do. Tell the girl with the scar to tell me, Arya said. She saves me from telling lies, he said, glancing at the girl and finding her watching him with her unblinking count. She writes calmer than I speak. She will write. By dawn, men who had oiled their wrists were gone or arrested where they had fallen snoring. Their wrists slick with old oil and embarrassment. They would be made to scrub things. Swords lived too long in men's minds when their arms were idle. Clubs too. But a scrubbed stone taught 2 lessons at once, about dirt and about patience. Arya had Meryl set them to the gutters where garbage and rain made their marriage and then requested a divorce. In the afternoon, they were all too sore to be zealots. The song in the riverlands grew clever. It learned to name days of the week and put a promise on each: red sky for Tuesday, blue word for Friday, the promise of the prince for Sunday when the markets were more crowded and the right kind of ear more idle. The boy with pale hair learned to put his hand along the neck of his horse the way men did who had not been thrown very often. He learned to pause long enough for people to steady their breath. He learned to smile without showing teeth. It was a good lesson. Teeth were dangerous to show when your mouth was still soft. He learned to refrain from promises that could be read later with disappointment. When asked if he would forgive debts, he said he would remember them. When asked if he would protect the faith, he said he would light a candle. When asked if he would bring back dragons, he laughed for the first time, and the laugh had a small, honest ugliness to it, as if it had been pulled off a line before it was dry. People liked that laugh. It reminded them that they did not need to make room for fire in their houses. Arya sent messages written like jokes with answers that weren't. She sent her own singer with a better ear. She sent plain riders with bread to villages that had only the old words and none of the new songs. She sent quill with coin to men whose wives were tired of nonsense. She sent Merrill to count who wore leather in the wrong places for a farmer and who had learned to cut his hair like a lord. She sent Omero to listen in the places where people set their backs to walls close to the kitchen door and talked as if their words would steam and rise. She did not send herself. She knew the places where her face would set dogs barking. The first time the boy and the queen met, there were only 7 people in the room, and 5 of them were standing in the shadows. The room was a stable until that morning. They met among the warm animals and counted on the smell to make them speak shorter truths. He had pale hair and eyes the color of at least 3 things she could name: the sea in a glass, the sky before snow, Gilith Asku. Led too quickly and shocked into a network of tiny cracks. He was younger than his song had made him and older than his jaw should have allowed, and in that measurement she saw the men behind him like ghosts with their hands on his elbows, guiding, tugging. "You have a crown that fits you," he said. His voice had a small stumble at the end of the sentence, a little boy's slip that he did not correct. Clever, she thought, or he truly was young and his tutors were using what they had. "I have a chair that doesn't," she said. "Do you sleep in it?" he asked, not to be insolent, but because he did not yet know how to arrange his insolences to be useful. "I sleep where cats once slept," she said. "It keeps me honest to wake where kittens have been." He blinked at that, and she saw the real boy under the powdered one. "Do you miss it when they're gone?" he asked. "Yes, but there are cats again." "I have had dogs," he said. "They were given to me as presents by men who wanted to be seen giving. I did not know how to let them love me." "You will learn to let people love you," she said. "If you live long enough to see that love is work and not song." The steward behind him coughed in a way that was not a cough. He had the look of a man who sought corners even in round rooms, a man whose mind preferred right angles to curves. Arya addressed him then, though she didn't look at him. "You have allowed a boy to stand where he can be struck. That is a stupid arrangement of furniture." "We believe the room is safe," the steward said. "We made precautions." "You are a precaution," Arya said, "and you are not. Do not lie to yourself about which is which." "You have killed all the houses that could oppose you," the boy said. He said it with a marveling more than a condemnation, and she heard the song's echo behind her ear. "I have killed the heads of them," she said. "Houses are rooms full of cousins. They pour out like flour the moment you shake the sack." "I haven't been shaking since." "Then what do you want?" he asked. He asked as if for himself and for the room and for the men behind him and for the song. It was a useful question to hear aloud. "To hold the cat," she said, and that made him smile despite the steward's breath curdling with disapproval. "And to teach you to hold one without bleeding to death." "I am no one's apprentice," he said, and the line was too neat to be truly his. He did not like it as much as he had wanted to like it. "I am promised to a story," she said. "Do you enjoy that story? Does it taste good when you say it before sleep? Does it keep you warm when the fire goes low?" He looked at the horse behind her because he could not look at her just then. It was good, that avoidance. It showed he had a sense of himself beyond the room. "Sometimes," he said, "he was honest when tired." She tucked that away. "When you are done," she said, "send your singer to me. I will send him back with a new verse. It will make you less god and more man. People will like you less for it and love you more." He swallowed. "And if I don't send him, I will send bread," she said. "Bread and a story about how you once laughed without showing your teeth." He laughed then without showing them. He was very young. She felt a grief she did not have time to carry and did not have permission to set down. "I'll send him," he said, and the steward behind him made a small sound that might have been a protest or a prayer. When she returned to the city, winter had begun to nose at the air like a dog at a kitchen door. Leaves fell at odd angles. Sansa's raven came with a message the length of a breath. Frost. Arya answered with a word that had more to do with her than with the sky. Ready. The ships came with the painted eyes just before dawn, because men who believe in terror like the hour just before other men wake. The fog rolled in with them as if it had always belonged to those hulls. The bells on the ropes across the harbor were wrapped in cloth. The cloth drank the sound and made it lazy. Men on the quay could smell tar and salt and a faint sweet stink of a thing dead too long in a hold. Men in the towers held their breath, because breath is a bell when it is released, and sometimes it matters whether the bell rings. Arya had ordered fast boats made, small as beetles, their sides smeared with something the maester had mixed that would make rope slip from other rope like eel from a hand. She had ordered nets sewn not of hemp but of horsehair and hair combings swept from women's basins and the rags of sailors. She had had boys practice throwing them over fences to tangle the legs of men as a game. She had had bells lifted at the last and wrapped only in gauze, and she had told a line of girls to take stations with knives and also with eyes sharper than knives. When the first prow slid along the chain's old markers, a bell rang and did not ring, a muffled bleat. Girls cut gauze. The bells rang properly then, and their ringing grew like honest speech. Men on decks laughed because bells do not frighten men who intend to do harm. Men who intended to be frightened had already stayed home. She went out in a beetle boat with Meryl behind her and another woman with arms roped hard from lifting stones. Omero stood on a quay as if he were looking at a lover he had left but never stopped thinking of. Quill stood at the counting table because coin mattered in battle. It was a measure of how long men would stay before fear made their feet forget their allegiance. The girls with eyes called counts. 3 on the left, 1 in the middle, 5 standing off to see if others bled first. Arya's hands shook once and then did not. Needle lay on a board next to her, eating a slow fog that made the steel look like it had left the world and not returned. They slid alongside a ship with paint that had run and been repainted and run again and been painted yet again. A face layered on a face layered on a face. A man on that deck grinned, and his grin was the grin of the kind of man who thought his own ugliness a compliment from the gods. He named himself captain for those who did not already know him and had no need to. He had women's hair tied to his belt and boys' teeth hanging in a line where most men would have worn bits of bone for luck. He had luck in a pouch and called it courage. Arya did not announce herself. She had no need to. She had given the city her name and the sea did not require it. She sent the first net. It caught a man's ankles and his hands too when he tried to free himself and forgot that hands and feet make the same gestures when frightened. She sent the second net and the third, and men shouted and tripped and fell on others and made a country of foolishness that she was happy to help them govern. When the captain leaped, he leaped well. He landed on the beetle boat with a weight that made it bob like a blessed thing. His dagger skittered from his sleeve and into the fog, disappointed. He laughed, having others have a worse time than he was having, and drew another blade from a place on his person where no blade should be kept unless a man is very sure he will never sit again. She met him, that was all. She met him as she had met 100 like him in alleys, and in the slow light of taverns, and once on the roof of a house where a woman had planted herbs in a row and watered them with the water she had cried into. He was big and quick people have a terrible habit of thinking that quickness is uniqueness. She watched his shoulders and not his hands, and his shoulder told her the story of his next move, and she wrote an ending in the shape of a slash that bled his arm and made his hand disappoint him. He laughed again because the laugh had been put in him at birth and he had not learned any other sound. She touched his throat, lightly, as if pointing out the way to a stranger. He tried to put his weight where it would be useful and found no place. Men whose luck lives in a pouch have empty pockets at last. When he fell, he did not fall like a man who had been pushed. He fell like a child who had not learned yet which bits of the world could be trusted. The ship with the painted eyes slid on, blind to it. The fog lifted in patches. On the left, men backed water and then learned the lesson she had planned for them. That horsehair and rag in water catch a propeller like grief catches a lie. On the right, men tried to set fire to tar and found their hands too wet to strike sparks with any dignity. In the middle, a boat full of men who had been promised no deaths in the first minutes stepped up onto the quay and were met not by swords but by club ends and by a woman who said to each in turn, "Home!" and handed him a coin she had made sure was not clipped. Men who were asked if they wanted to go home did not often say no unless a song stood behind them holding their spine. The reaver died or did not. What mattered was that the painted eyes blinked no more and the men on the piers learned to watch for ships that thought themselves alive and bring them to the same sorry sentence as all living things: want and a quiet. Arya's boat knocked against a pole and made a low noise like a throat clearing. She looked at her hands. The left had blood on it that she wiped on her trousers because it had to go somewhere, and why not there? She breathed and let the breath out careful. Back in the hall, dripping slightly with fog that had found a place inside her collar and refused to leave, she took the coin Omero slid onto the table and turned it. It had a small nick on one edge in the shape of a crescent. He raised a brow. She set it down again. "Take a name," she said to the air. "Spend it well." The boy with pale hair sent his singer as promised. The singer came with a song that wanted to be a rope and tie knots around people's ankles. He sat on the edge of the table and swung his legs like a boy and said he had a tune that would please her if she had ever loved anyone. The song was better now. It had found its pace. It had not found its humility. She did not order him to stop. She ordered him to listen. She told him 3 stories. One about a baker who had let a loaf burn so he could watch the sun come up and had then sold the loaf for the same price and put a coin in the jar marked for Widow Branna and told a lie to a woman so she would have a sweeter day. One about a man who had killed a rat with kindness because he had discovered that there were only rats left in a world where he had punished a rat and everyone had noticed. One about a girl who had learned to carry a barrel by the bracing points of her hips. He wrote and crossed and wrote again and frowned. The song grew edges. The boy in it turned and showed his dirty fingernails. He cried once when he cut his thumb and showed no one because he hadn't known he was crying. The singer hated that part until he sang it in the street and a fishwife stopped and put her hand on her chest and said, "There now," to a child who had not fallen. He sang it twice, and the third time the boy was a man, and that was the end of that part of the story. The steward behind the boy with pale hair wrote letters that were intercepted by no one and by everyone. He wrote to the Vale and to Gulltown and to the Iron Bank because men who did not keep their own corners liked to point out others. He wrote to a man with a shop of carpets who sold secrets as if they were lengths of wool. He wrote to a man with an orchard who had the appetite of a goat. Arya invited him to the room without corners and let him stand in the curve and try to square it with his mind. He looked ill. She offered him a chair and did not insist when he refused it. "Your boy can be good," she said. "Goodness is a craft like barrel making. You are teaching him to be a poem. Poems don't carry water." "People do not get wet when a poem is good enough," he said, which was the so. Arty of thing that made Quill scratch her jaw with her coin. "People are carried without realizing it." "Carried where you want them to be carried," Arya said. "You want him to be something only you can imagine, because you like the way your own mind looks when you look into it." "You are cruel," he said, and that was a complaint he had not allowed himself to make in a long time, so it came out as if someone else had scolded him through his own mouth. "I am busy," she said. "Cruelty is an indulgence people mistake for haste. I do not have time for either." Pull your hands out of the boy's elbows. If he falls then, he falls into his own shape. "You would see him dirted," he said. "I would see him alive," she said. "Dirt can be washed. Death cannot be talked into different garments, no matter how clever your pen." She told him that the Iron Bank would not back his boy because the bank had begun to count the city's new ledger and found it to their liking. She told him about ships. She told him about coins with nicks that were nets. He understood none of it and all of it. I will find the parts of your plan that are made of words and pull them out with the right tongue, she said. And then when it stops making sense to itself, it will sit down. It is hard for men with plans to admit when their plans are tired. You will rest them if you are wise. You kill with kindness, he said. I prefer to kill with grammar, she said. It leaves less to clean. When the boy and the steward left the Riverlands, it was not in triumph and it was not in flight. It was in that relief men feel when they have remembered they have a home and can go there without losing the word they thought would become their name forever. They left with a song that made them men and not gods. They left with 2 geese and 1 dog who had come along on their own and were not made to return. They left with a letter from Arya that said only, if you need bread, ask the bell and also do not ring it at night. The steward read it and laughed, and the boy laughed too, and they were better for it. Letters came from Winterfell again and again. The method of address changed. It became less formal in winter, as if the cold made sisters more honest. It became stiffer in spring, as if Sansa's hands remembered the old court and its requirements and wanted to practice grace. A time came when a raven brought a letter written in a hand that had tried to be pretty and failed. It was not Sansa. It was a child who said, "My lady says I must tell you that the gods would keep its own counsel. The tree you planted," she says, "will get its counsel from the same wind even if it is far." The child had drawn a leaf in the margin, and the leaf looked like a boat that was learning how to float. The Iron Bank envoy returned with a different ring and a different shawl. He smiled at Quill in a way that said the previous sum had been too heavy for his neck, and he had learned to ask for lighter coins because his head hurt less at the end of the day when he did. "We will accept grain and roads and a silence at midnight when the markets sleep," he said. "We will accept kind words to our cousins when they come to port. We will accept an honest platform for our factor to speak on in the market square, with a guard that does not have to watch his back for knives. We will accept being called just men by women who have the power to have us called worse." "You will get all that," Arya said, "and you will get to see your own reflection in the river without needing to ask whether it is gold. In return, you will tell the men who thought to put a boy on a chair with a spike for a seat that we have stopped selling spikes down here. They can find them in their own houses somewhere and sit on those if they want to remember pain." The bank envoy bowed at just the right depth. He had learned the weight of his head by now. He did not ask to see the iron. Men forgot about the iron when the city gave them other metals to look at. Copper for coin, brass for hinges, tin for ladles. She had ordered a forge built in a place that had burned too often. She had brought smiths whose hands were gentle with iron and too hard for men's chins. She had brought a boy who had learned from a man who had made swords for princes and from a woman who had made nails for fishermen. The boy hammered and praised the iron when it bent the right way, and he scolded it softly when it did not. He did not know he had learned this from watching Arya talk to a city. She did not melt the chair. She did not lift it out of the hall and carry it into the street and set it ablaze in a public show. She did not have patience for shows unless they fed someone or put out a fire. She did something quieter, which is to say something louder. She had the smiths take a piece from the chair each week when the city slept hardest. A blade here, a point there, a tangle of metal that had been placed long ago as ornament by a madman with a love of discomfort. They took those pieces and they made them into things that would take patience to notice. Hinges for the doors at the school where the girls would go to learn to write and then learn to count and then learn to talk in rooms with men and not be shushed. Nails for the scaffolds that would rise to repair roofs and then be kept for the next work and the next. Hooks for the market where meat would hang and not rot in the sun. A thin rail that ran along the walk near the sapling so old women could steady themselves when they came to lay their palms against bark. A bar over a window that a boy had once dreamed of climbing out and had not, because the bar had told him to wait. When there was more iron gone than left, and men began to say they remembered the chair taller and larger and more dangerous, Arya moved her plain craftsman's seat up one step without telling anyone. The chair did not like it and it did not dislike it. Chairs have the decency to stay out of such arguments. People only noticed later that when the queen sat and listened, the iron behind her did not loom the way it had. It watched. It had become a thing that watched her while she watched others, and that felt proper and fair. The mother's bell became the city's bell before anyone had agreed to such a change. Names climb on things and ride them, and sometimes the things do not notice at once. He rang in the mornings for bread, and at noon when a man had fallen off a roof, and at dusk when the ships came in, and at midnight for silence. Not every night, but enough that people began to own the hour. The girl with the scar invented a way to fold the ledger pages that kept rain off. The women who kept the bread queues invented a new insult for men who tried to push. The insult did not strike hard, but it struck true, and men stopped pushing when they heard it because their ears turned red and they became used to saying "after you," and found that those words did not poison their tongues after all. The man with the good boots learned to count births. He had to be taught how to tell a woman when she looked tired that she looked fine rather than that she had acted as a woman should act. He learned to say the baby looked like its father when it looked like its mother, and then later he learned to say it looked like its mother even when it did not, because that made a certain other kind of balance in a small kitchen. He became useful enough that some of the people who had once hated him only disliked him, and then others forgot to hate him at all. That was a victory, and it tallied. The wolves came closer to the gate one morning. Not within the arrow line, but near enough that men on the wall shifted their feet. Arya went out as far as she ever did and stood where the Kingswood path bent. The large one and the smaller one stood and watched, not waiting for an order, because wolves do not take orders from chairs or bells. She breathed. She did not say the words she had said before. She said different ones, smaller ones that belonged to the wind between them. The large wolf lay down and put its head on its paws as if it had found a room without corners in the leaves. The small one sat and then came closer and then stopped a distance that a child would measure by hopping. Arya smiled. There was no bargain made. There did not need to be. She had learned the shape of that lack and wore it like a shirt under armor. One evening, too silent to be left alone, the woman from the house came again, smiling in that way that said her face liked to make poems of other people's expressions and not of her own. "The Reaver is a rumor," she said. "He sank because he wanted to know what the bottom looked like, and it obliged him. We took the steward. He died with a poem that was almost good. We put it under his tongue as a coin and sent him under the river. That will answer to your numbers for now." "For now," Arya said. "You changed the measure," the woman said. "Our God will tolerate it until he tires of the taste." "He will tire of his own taste before he tires of mine," Arya said, and that was an act of arrogance she allowed herself because she needed to keep one. A person without one arrogance cannot be seen by some people at all. "I will pay a small coin of a different kind now," she added, and took from her pocket the coin with the nick in the shape of the crescent that she had carried on and off since the day the deaths began. She held it up and then put it down. The woman did not pick it up. She looked at it as if it were a face to be worn, and she had decided hers fit her more comfortably. "We will not fall into your pocket," the woman said. "I will not fall into yours," Arya replied. "This is tedious," the woman said. "You are tedious." "Good," Arya said. "It means we are doing the same work. I do not need the world to see me as interesting. I need it to fit." In winter they held a moot in the hall that made old men blink and young boys fidget and women settle their shoulders in a way that meant they intended to be comfortable as long as they needed to be, and they would not let anyone cut the session short. Sansa came south to sit and watch and to be watched. They looked more alike like this than they had when they were girls. The set of the mouth that said their mother, the hands that their father would have recognized by the way the fingers showed in the cold. They did not embrace in the hall because some things belonged to rooms with corners and some belonged to others. The moot began with a table brought out from the council room. An old thing with burned marks and map scratches and the ghost of a line where the trident had once been drawn deep and then sanded shallow. Arya put a book on it and a scale. Quill put a bag of coin and then added 2 more and then took one away because it felt right. Maester Kahlo put a sheaf of drawings of pipes and gutters and a neat cross-section of a well that looked like a cake. Merrill put a club and then a broom. The mother's bell put a bell. Omero put a piece of rope with a knot that had saved his life twice and may yet be required to do so again. Sansa put a little box that had once held needles and now held different ones. "Counts," Arya said. "We begin with counts. We have agreed we will not allow the faith to carry swords. We will let them carry soup. We will not allow men to own men. We will insist that men and women own their knights if they wish them. We will declare that the city is not moved by whims. We will make a law that men may not be made into a song without their leave, and if the song is sung anyway, it will be sung off-key and everyone will know why. We will... What else do we want? To call the North by its own name and not ask it to bend when it wishes to bow only to itself, Sansa said simply. Done, Arya said, and the way she said it fell into the hall like a weight and settled the long argument before it could even gather its favorite words. There was grumbling from some corners because old habits like to be fed even after they have been told they are dead. But the grumblers did not find the proper song and abandoned the hum. We will not take children to war, Meryl said. We will ask them to carry water and then to carry words, and then we will teach them counting and clubs, and then, if they insist on fighting after that, at least they will know what they've chosen. We will count women's sayings as orders if they are said to men who have clubbed the wrong head, Quill said. The wrong head is any head that hasn't offended yet. We will let the river have its work, Maester Kahlo said. We will keep men from hurting it to make profits that spoil. If a man wants to take a boat out with a net, he will learn where the young fish live and will leave them alone. We will ring bells at set times, the bell said, and at no others. We will ring when mothers say to ring, and we will not ring when their babies are asleep. We will make our bells speak for the deaf, which is to say we will make our hands the bells and hold up signs. We will be clever in how we tell time. We will not hide books, Omero said. We will let people read after dark. We will make shutters that pull the light tight to the room so no one needs to fear a visiting eye. We will move the chair, Arya said. A ripple moved across faces as wind moves across a barley field. Not out, she added before it became a gale. We will slide it closer to the plain chair. We will make the place of sitting feel like work again and not like spectacle. They moved it with 6 men and 2 women and a boy who stood behind the chair and rested his shoulder on it in a way that made people believe it was moving itself a little. When it slid, Iron sighed. Or perhaps it was Quill who sighed, because moving things that disliked being moved is a kind of expense paid in breath, and she had kept the tally for a long time. The last to speak was the girl with the scar, who had not meant to speak at all. She lifted her hand, an old-school gesture from an old place where men got to speak when they lifted their hands and women when they had something better than bread. Her voice lifted and found it had resonance in the big chamber. We will keep a book of kindnesses, she said. Not gifts and not debts, but kindnesses. We will make a note every time someone refrains. That is a kind of work too. They agreed, and Quill found the right leather for the cover, and Maester Kahlo found paper that refused to blot in a way that would make people give up, and Meryl taught boys to write their names with pride and shame, and the Bells girl wrote the first entry. Lena, who lifted the scales. In spring the tree put out new leaves with the confidence of a hand rising to answer a question in a school where the teacher did not throw chalk at children to show he loved them. Men slept by it in the afternoon in a way they said they did not do in public. Women brought babies and pressed their brows to cool bark. Arya came when she could and spoke to it without language. Sometimes she set the coin with the nick on the rail for a moment and then took it back because there were still hands that might take it and spend it on something she would not approve of. The sound of its falling would be wrong. She had not expected peace to be this noisy. The city buzzed. It sang. It argued. It scraped and clanged and dropped and lifted and ached and complained and found new ways to laugh. The song that had been almost good became a lullaby in some houses and a marching tune in some fields, and in the city a silly ditty children sang to mock those who had believed too easily. The boy with pale hair sent one letter and then another. They said, "We found a village in the hills that had a well that had not been deepened since a boy named Noel fell into it 80 years ago and lived. We took a rope. Now no one will fall again." They said, "We want to change our hair. Do you think that will make us less likely to be used?" They said, "What do you do when you wake with a name in your mouth that you do not recognize? You give it away," Arya wrote. "You speak it to the mist, or to the first stranger who can bear to carry a word without making it his entire life." She sent the letter, and when she regretted the ease in it, she laughed at herself and stopped regretting. People wanted her to save something of herself from ease. She did not mind giving a little away when she had coin in her purse to spare, and she did. On a long day that was to be remembered as beginning with a pigeon letting its opinion fall on Quill's shoulder and ending with a sunset so clean men stopped mid-curse to look, Sansa took Arya's hands in the godswood that was trying to be and said, "I have made a treaty with you in my head 100 times. Now I will say it out loud. We will be the North. You will be the rest, which is an insult only to men who think the North is the whole world. We will send you grain when we have more than we need. You will send us books and a man or a woman to teach and not to correct. We will not send swords to your wars because we will not have wars for a time. You will not send swords to ours because you will not have wars for a time either. If a person runs north because they cannot breathe here, I will teach them to breathe there. If a person runs south because they cannot breathe there, you will teach them to breathe here. We will remember that breath is a bell and that the bell can ring in quiet." Arya squeezed her hand. "We will share the same wind." They embraced then, because there was not a hall full of eyes to require pretense. Sansa smelled like clean wool and ink and cold air. Arya smelled like the city and the sea and iron and oranges. They did not compare smells. They did not need to. They had made an old piece new because they had chosen not to dress it in general words. The day after, a child was born under a cart near the market because the mother had not wanted to go to the midwife, because a story had told her that women with coins for services liked to count the coins more than they liked to catch the child. 3 women who sold onions and who had not minded the mother's previous manners caught the baby and rubbed it and laughed in a way that made men stop telling lies long enough to say good morning. The mother named the child Peace, then changed her mind and called it Market, then changed again and named it Silence, and the whole city accepted that too because names were better when they could be things. The Reaver's cousins sent letters and demands and a ship with a sail patched in 3 different places with 3 different cloths. That ship went home without visiting because Meryl's watch set a contest on the quay that men could win only by laying down their weapons and making dough. Men who thought to gain honor by keeping blood on their hands found they could gain honor by keeping flour there instead, and it confused them into good behavior. Arya watched and did not laugh and allowed herself to imagine that she had planned this exactly. She had not. She had planned to survive and make the city fit, and that had made room for other people's inventions, which was better. The bank sent a box with nothing in it but a single key, silver and heavy. It came with a note that said, "When you want to open a room that used to be closed to you." Quill threw back her head and laughed so hard a pigeon on the roof above her lost its balance and had to flap twice wildly to get back its dignity. "We have been given the key to a room full of rooms," she said. "We will return it if the rooms are empty. We will keep it if the rooms have chairs and tables we can sit at together." She wore the key at her belt until she forgot it was there. Then she remembered and took it off and put it in a drawer and put a note on the drawer that said, "Not until needed, signed by no one." The man with the good boots took a wife. He had not meant to. He had meant to spend the rest of his days counting other people's teeth, and one day when he was counting a woman's with care and calling them fine, she laughed at him, and he saw that he had counted the teeth of his own solitude down to nothing and did not mind. The wedding was not grand.
Ayasena pot.
Quill sent a pan. The mother's bell sent no bell. Meryl sent 2 chairs he had made himself that were sturdy and not comfortable, which was his way of asking the couple to sit with straight backs and watch the world well. The man cried during the eating and wiped his eyes without embarrassment. The woman kissed his good boots and his bad boot, which he had never had until he had met her, and then everything was sore and everything was well. In time, slowly, and also quickly, the city became the thing Arya had said it could be when she was only thinking about it and not yet sitting in it. It bent, it gave, it held her. It also hurt her, because love is a scratchy blanket, warm, yes, but coarse. There were fights in alleys and cuts that did not close, and men who would not learn to say after you no matter how often they were shown the ease of it. Sometimes the women who had invented the insult for men who pushed let their own words curdle and had to be reminded by girls with better tempers. Sometimes Quill forgot to count the kindnesses because she was tired of counting and wanted to tell a story without numbers, and then remembered and turned it back into numbers with a sigh that made men decide to find a different woman to marry because they would never beat this one and did not need to. Sometimes the bell rang at a bad time. He was human. Bells are held by hands. And sometimes Arya woke with a name in her mouth, and the name turned out to be someone in a lane at the end of the week who needed bread or not dying or a rope lifted off a neck. Then she would tell herself that she did not believe in such things, and then she would go and save that person, and then she would say to herself afterward that it had been coin and strategy and luck and not name she had paid, and yet she put the coin with the nick on the rail again that night and held her hand on it and took it back, as she had done a dozen times and would do a dozen times more. On a day in high summer, when the heat lay like a full sack on everyone's shoulder and even the flies moved as if they had heavier bones than usual, Arya walked into the hall and found it full in the way it was when people hadn't been told there would be a moot but had understood it anyway. The chair sat. The iron behind it watched. The room without corners remembered its usefulness. The sapling in the court beyond moved a leaf with the authority of a king's hand. She went up the steps and sat, because she had not wanted to sit and knew that was the day to do it. "I will speak," she said, and her voice traveled, learning the stones again as if it had become rusty and needed oil. "There has been a question I have answered 100 times in parts, and today I will answer it whole. The question is whether I will hold this chair until I am old and useless, until the barbs climb into my shoulders and make my spine theirs. I will not. I love this city, and I know it does not love me the way it loves itself, and we are better for that. I will hold it as long as I am needed, and then I will put my hand on someone else's shoulder, and then I will place my hands on the rails of the godswood and not look back." People murmured. They did not cheer because cheering is too sharp a sound for an answer this soft. The bell put his hand on his bell and did not ring. Merrill stood with his hands behind him and said, "Who?" Because men like him need a name to put inside their ribs, so they do not feel a draft there. "I do not know," Arya said simply. "We will know when we count who holds the cat without bleeding and without making the cat shriek. We will know when we see whose. The first act is to move the chair, not sit in it. We will know when we watch someone put down bread before they talk. We will know it in our hands and not our mouths, and that is how it should be." Sansa, from her place in the hall, nodded once. Agreement written in the language sisters keep. Quill wiped her brow because heat makes truth stick. Maester Kahlo wrote something down and then crossed it out and then left the line because crossing out tells part of a story too. Omero looked toward the docks, because see men measure time by departures and their hearts by how often they come home. "And now," Arya said and smiled because she knew the value of the next thing she would give. "We will do the last thing I meant to do when I came here the first day I did. Bring in the iron." They brought in a piece of the chair they had saved for this, and the smiths carried it like a bier and yet smiled. Heat hit the room like a revelation when they lit the forge's mouth, and people drew back with delight because delight is a kind of fear when it is clean. The children pressed forward and were held back by hands that had learned to permit boldness up to the point it would make a child's ears ring for days. The smith boy came with his iron tongs and his hammer in his hand. He looked at Arya and she nodded once and he began. Slow. Slow enough that people could see and not only guess. Slow enough that the iron seemed to listen and then consent. He made nails, yes. He made hinges, yes. He made hooks that would hold as long as they were asked to and no longer. And then, with a care that made a silence grow among the watchers, he made a needle. Not a sword, a needle. A sliver of iron that fit in the palm of a woman's hand, and then in the strap of a dress, and then under a pillow, and then in the seam of a sleeve. "For mending," the boy said, and the hall laughed because it could not help itself, and laughter cleans a room. He held it up and Arya reached and took it and set it on the table next to needle, and for a second her hand hovered above both. A balance made flesh. "Work," she said, and it did. Night came and she walked alone as she preferred to. Because alone is not the same as lonely, and because the city had learned to own its lights and set them at windows without thinking of wildfire. She went to the godswood. The air smelled of warm bark, of earth turned by hands that didn't know what letters were and had written a poem anyway by how they laid the spade. The wolves did not come that night. They did not need to. The tree lifted a leaf as if in salute, and the leaf dropped a shadow on her cheek that had perhaps always belonged there and had only needed the right angle to be seen. She sat on the rail that had been made from the iron that had once cut men by mistake. The rail held. Things would also fail. She knew that. She did not pretend to promise otherwise. She heard footsteps then that were not hers and were allowed to be there. The girl with the scar came and sat on the bench and did not speak for a while. "Someone wrote in the book," she said at last. "That is the point of it. Arya said dryly. They wrote your name, the girl said. They wrote Arya. Who held? Arya looked at the tree. There are worse lies, she said. It's not a lie, the girl said. She leaned back and looked up and let her neck know it was attached to her head. I used to think I would die in a lane and someone would take my shoes because they were newer than theirs. Then I thought I would die with a bell in my ears and be unable to push the sound away. Now I think I will die in a bed where I can see a leaf. That is your work. I have not counted it because I don't need to. Count, Arya said. It will help someone else later. We cannot throw the ledger away because we think we have made it unnecessary. That would be pride, and pride is the bell that rings too loud. The girl nodded and closed her eyes. Arya looked at the needle on her palm and then tucked it into the seam of her sleeve. She would mend. She would cut when needed. She would mend more often because that was the harder work and because it lasted. Shortly before dawn, because dawn needs its short preludes, she heard the bell ring once because a woman by the baker's had dropped a pot and broken it and had not had coin for a new one, and the bell told the city the kind of silence to make to hear that small sound and answer it. She heard wolves long and far enough away to be story and near enough to be true. She heard the river. She heard her own breath and thought of the first day in the hall and the last day she would sit and how both days were the same weight and different shapes. She thought of a boy counting without looking down and of a man counting births and of Quill counting coins and kindnesses and of Merrill counting footsteps where they didn't belong and of the bell counting nights when he would ring and nights when he would put his bell under his bed and sleep. She thought of Omero counting ropes and of Maester Kahlo counting pipes and of Sansa counting leaves in a god's wood that held its breath in winter and let it out in summer. She stood. She went back in. The doors made their small complaint as they always did. She smiled at it as one smiles at an old woman who scolds as a form of love. The guard with the flat ear nodded. The man with the good boots had his bad boot on and did not look ashamed. The boy with the stitched hand waved with the hand he had cut and looked proud because his stitches were neat. The chair watched. The iron watched from its new job as rail and nail and hinge and hook. The city breathed. She said the word that began all days here when they were good, and even when they were not. Next. And there was an ending hidden in that beginning, and it favored her, as she had favored the city, with a hand that knew how much to hold and how much to let go.